Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Is everybody excited to be here tonight? It's coming from a taxpayer, I think, there. But enjoy. This will be a fun time. I think you're going to have a good time. You have tonight. We have some very special people speaking here tonight. So basically, what it is, you're going to introduction to various components of the city of Worcester, different parts. You see this over the next months when you're here, and how it's all put together and how we all come together as a city. During this time of really a lot of misinformation on Facebook, social media, a lot of uncertainty. You know, it's critical as a community we have a good idea how government really operates. And I see a lot of community people here tonight. And so it's really a good time to get to know one another, and we have some good respectful dialogue back and forth, and to talk to one another and really get to understand how the city really works. While Council Pasillo will cover the general expectations of the course and introduce tonight's speakers, I will give you a brief overview of the structure of the Academy. As Eliane has said, the Academy is made up of several people who put this all together. District 1 City Councilor Johnny Pasillo, our City Clerk, he's the clerk, he runs the city too, with Nico Vangelli, and former Mayor Joe O'Brien, who really started this about 15, 16 years ago. I'm pressing too many buttons here, sorry about that. And Joe O'Brien couldn't be here tonight, got a little fender bender on the way in here from Boston, so he's going to be late or if he can make it at all. So over the next 5 sessions, you're going to hear from leaders of several departments about their work from a high level. We hope that you'll have the opportunity to ask questions and have respectful discourse around your experiences. While you want you to learn and have some fun, but have some fun with this too, you know. You can get some cheap shots once in a while about the city, but because you're all taxpayers here, so this is your government, right? And maybe this will give you some inspiration to join a board or a commission. And we have a lot of openings on boards and commissions. We're looking for volunteers all the time. It's on the website. You can apply anytime for a board or commission. There's a number of opening positions. And as a public servant, I get into this business to help people, and hopefully you'll learn from this and really bring something back to your community, your neighborhood. And this will be able to get you to know your community better by breaking bread with your fellow residents here tonight. And feel free to empowered to speak up with the information you get from the Civics Academy. Again, have some fun, enjoy the process, and I look forward to seeing you at graduation. Have a good graduation night. I think we're feeding them every week, too, right? All right, so we got some pizza tonight. Pizza was pretty good. That was from Garden Fresh on Main Street. So now I'd like to call up who I think is probably one of the best city councilors I've ever met. And I've been around a while, not too long. I don't think I'm too old, but Jenny Pasillo is first term on this council, and she does a wonderful job. If you're in her district, if you ever have a complaint, she'll be at your house next morning having coffee with you. So she cares about the community. She cares about the city of Worcester a lot. Please welcome up Jenny Pasillo.
Thank you so much, Mayor Petty. It's always nice when people introduce me and they like me. It's a good feeling. I want to echo what Mayor Petty said in just having fun. So to me, civics and municipal government is one of the funnest things that we could talk about and think about. And I think about it a lot. And my example to people is always, if you were to ask all 11 city councilors, what is the role of municipal government? You'd probably get 11 different answers. And that's the beauty of it, because we all see things differently. And it's the same with everyone here. Everyone probably has different ideas in mind of what government should and shouldn't do. And it's just really great to talk about it in a respectful, just a nice way and listen to different points of view. So I do want to do a couple housekeeping things. Tonight we have Tim McGurthy and Peter Dunn, and all the speakers in this program, they're volunteering their time. And they're all really smart and work super hard all day at City Hall. So it's wonderful that we have the chance to listen to them and learn a few things. And absolutely share all the information you learn. It's, pass it on to your neighbors and friends if someone has a question, and they can always reach out to us. And all of these sessions are going to be put online. So if you want to rewatch it and get some more notes, you're absolutely welcome to. Our next session is going to be in the Sachs room at the Worcester Public Library, just because this room was not available. So that will be March 19th, same time, pizza, seltzer, all the great things. And I also want to thank Eliana and Nico. They really did all the work setting this up. They did such a great job. And so I'm very, very grateful. Nights like this are so important because we can understand how our city works. And once you understand it, that gives you the tools to change it or make it better or fix it. And to me, it's just a really great chance to have your voice heard and learn how to have a bigger impact. So it is my pleasure to introduce Tim McGurthy, the Chief Financial Officer for the City of Worcester. Mr. McGurthy and I talk every single Monday when I have questions about the budget, and he's so smart and wonderful. Tim plays a key role in keeping our city running. He manages the budget, financial planning, and major investments. So his work really ensures that Worcester stays on solid financial ground, so we have the money to pay people and fix potholes and fund our schools. Thank you so much. Let's all welcome Mr. McGurthy.
Thank you very much. And the counselor is not joking. I have told her I feel like I have an audience of one on Tuesday nights, because she is the only one who reads every memo I submit, goes through it with a fine-tooth comb, and comes back with lots of questions, which I appreciate. So I have a lot of slides and a lot of information. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. I do hope in order to graduate, you don't have to pass a test, because this is pretty dense, and I wouldn't expect anyone to understand all of it. I'm still learning much of it. Municipal government and its finances are incredibly complicated. We are doing a lot of different things with a lot of different funding sources, and we're subject to a lot of different laws and regulations as it relates to what we can raise and what we can spend and how we do it. So what you're going to see is a whole mix of things that we have to consider as we go forward with building a budget, implementing a budget, closing out a budget, and then trying to make the numbers add up at the end of the day and the end of the year. So, and I don't know if it's okay, I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. I want to try to get through all the slides, so I might give a short answer in between, but then a longer answer at the end. But if someone doesn't understand something that's up on the screen at any moment in time, feel free to raise your hand. Let's see, no. Sorry, and the mouse is not very responsive. Okay, so the interesting thing about the city is we are actually two budgets. We are not one budget. There is the city's municipal budget, which this year is about $920 million. But within that, there is the municipal side, which is city government, the operations that you would expect to see from city in terms of streets and sidewalks and police and fire and the like. But then there's also the school side, the Worcester Public Schools. The Worcester Public Schools budget is a subset of the city budget, but it is determined by state statute what it is, or at least what the minimum is, and then it is created, built, distributed by the school committee, not by the Worcester City Council. The mayor sits on both the city council and the Worcester School Committee, but I report to the Worcester City Council. Once those funds are allocated by the City Council over to the schools, it is up to the school committee, it is up to the superintendent to determine where those dollars go. And so that's why on the left here you can see the City of Worcester's budget. On the right you can see the Worcester Public Schools budget. Again, the Worcester Public Schools is a subset of the city, but it is not controlled by the same entities that would control the overall city budget. So what do we have to think about? Our financial structure is largely controlled by state law. We report to the Department of Revenue at the state. We are treated the same as all 365 cities and towns in Massachusetts. We have to do certain things at certain times. We have to report the revenues. We have to report the expenses. We have to complete certain filings along the way. And so we have to ensure that what we do meets all the requirements under state and ultimately federal law as well. Our revenues are limited. We can't go out and create new products, come out with innovative ways of making money because it has to meet certain state requirements. So we have three primary funding sources for local government. First is state aid. That state aid comes in two major tranches: local aid, which is a component that comes directly to the city for general operating expenses, and the other is education aid. And I'll talk a little bit about the foundation budget and how education funding is determined a little bit later on. The second is property taxes. So as you all know, any of you who own a property, you'll get a bill on a quarterly basis that assesses the value of your home, creates a value based on tax rates determined by City Council, an amount due, and then that amount is billed throughout the year on a quarterly basis. And then local fees. There are various fees that you might pay for speeding tickets, for building permits, for all the things that you engage with city government, trash bag fees, all the things you engage with city government. We're allowed under law to assess a fee for the cost of the service that it's providing. So we don't assess fees for anything other than something you might seek that not everyone else might have access to. If you don't want to buy trash bags, you don't pay the fee. If you don't build something, you don't pay the building permit. Taxes, however, you pay no matter what. Expenses as well are significantly limited. A huge portion of our budget, about 60%, I mentioned, goes to the Worcester Public Schools. That's by statute. That is not discretion. State law determines what an adequate educational spend is, and the city must meet that. So right off the bat, as we start building our budget, we know a certain percentage, around 60%, is going to the Worcester Public Schools or education in general. Second are intergovernmental charges. Again, coming off the top of aid coming to the city from the state, things like the Worcester Regional Transit Authority, the Central Mass Regional Planning Commission, certain regional obligations that the city might have are assessed against the city and paid out before the city's budget is fully created. And then we have significant costs that other large entities, many large entities might have: retirement, pensions, like most governments across the country, and some large corporations. The city has a pension system. That's a mandatory obligated amount we have to pay into that pension system, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail later. And then other post-employment costs, and you'll hear this mentioned now and then. It was at City Council last night. OPEB, other post-employment benefits. In Massachusetts, local governments are responsible for paying for health care costs, a portion of health care costs for retirees, as long as they've vested in the retirement system. So that is a cost we have to kind of balance and expect year over year as it relates to building that budget. And then debt service. About $100 million of the city's budget right off the top goes to debt service each year. That number has been growing as the city takes on new debt, things like schools. And so those are kind of items that come off the top, which ultimately leaves about 22% of the city's budget for what you could call discretionary items. Public works, police, fire, the things that you want your city to do comes out of that 22% element left. And then when you think that much of that is status quo, in other words, we have a police force, we have a fire department, we have DPW, when you talk about year-over-year increases, they're actually incredibly small because we have the prior year costs that we know we have to pay carrying forward, and then we have new costs coming from things like inflation or subscription increases, cost of living adjustments for various employees, union agreements. So that available budget year over year is actually really very small in terms of the amount of money you have to do new things or to expand things that you do. We also operate 4 enterprise or special revenue accounts. These are funds that are paid not through taxes, but directly through the ratepayers. If you have a water and sewer connection for the city, you pay a water and sewer bill. It doesn't come out of your taxes. It comes on based on the water you use and the sewer you use. Similarly, golf, if you never play golf, none of your money will go toward golf, but if you go play golf, those fees help support the golf course. And finally, parking. As you know, if you pull into a public parking garage, you have to pay a fee. It's not city monies that go towards those parking garages. It's the kind of fees that are paid in stay within that system. And then finally, so as we look at our budgets, we have to balance operational and capital demands. As you all know, every year there are buildings that need work, vehicles that need to be bought, initiatives, streets and sidewalks that need to be repaved. All of that comes out of the capital budget versus the operational budget. But the more you spend on the capital budget, the more you borrow money to pay for some of these big things. the more that becomes debt service going forward. It's like if you put a lot on your credit card bill, your credit card fees are going up, you're going to have to pay a lot month over month. It's the same for the city. And as I mentioned, that's over $100 million right now a year for the city based on debt. But I do like to point out, and the punchline isn't showing. Hold on. People complain about high taxes. For the average residential bill of $5,266, you get an incredible array of services. And I know people don't often believe that, they don't often think about that, but you get a free public education. That's cheaper than any private institution you could send your child to. That alone, K through 12 education. You get roads that get you from any part of the city to any other part of the city. You get green spaces and playgrounds to play in and enjoy. You get 24-hour security, 24-hour fire protection. You get access to literary and cultural offerings through the Worcester Public Library. You get job training assistance through the Economic Development Division. You get public health services, including services going towards homelessness, drug addiction, and the like through the Department of Health and Human Services. And every single resident, every single visitor can enjoy almost all of these benefits for the average price of $5,266 a year. And to me, that is an incredible efficiency of an organization to be able to provide all that. Is it first class, world class, best in class? Maybe not, but it's accomplished, and it's accomplished well, and it provides an array of services that people look for. So the budget process. So we actually go through two budget processes. We go through the spring budget process to build out the annual budget, and then we go through a fall budget process to refine that budget and to determine what were the actual revenues, what are the expenses we anticipate, and then importantly, you hear what free cash, what additional revenues have come in after the year's budget has been planned that we can now account for and expend. And that's an internal and external process, internal being working with city departments, looking at the restrictions on funds, looking at the revenues that we might expect, looking at the costs that we know we might have, coming up with a balanced budget. We have to submit a balanced budget. Similar city and state, budgets have to always be balanced. We then bring that to the city council for review and approval. In the fall, we bring back that budget at some level to say, here are the additional costs or here are the additional revenues. Before the city council sets tax rates, they need to approve that final element to the budget. That becomes the city's annual budget for the year. We base our budget on a financial integrity plan, which has been around since really the late 1990s. That plan lays out a number of criteria by which the city will build its budget on. First and foremost, we try to create a reserve that's equal to 10% of our overall budget. So as our budget grows, our reserve level has to grow. Those are monies put into a bond rating stabilization account, various reserve funds, that in case of financial catastrophe, the city has monies that it can use to pay for its critical services. In FY25, the current fiscal year, our general reserves make up about 10.7% of our existing budget. Established an irrevocable OPEB trust. I mentioned post-employment benefits, healthcare. We have a trust that we're putting money into to try at some point in time have those future costs paid for by the people earning them today. Right now, I will someday be generously provided healthcare benefits upon my retirement. The goal is to have me pay today so that when I'm no longer an employee, that benefit is not simply a gimme, it's something I've contributed to throughout my career. Debt service, we're trying to maintain debt service at a certain level so that the entire budget isn't consumed by debt service. That means limiting our major expenses, our borrowings, and the big capital items that we might do. Free cash, when we have cash available. So after we close a fiscal year, we look at all the money we took in, all the money we expended, any accounts that are due in the future that the state says you must account for now. We come up with what's called free cash. That's money that gets added to the budget for that next fiscal year to say, okay, There was $10 million left over from the prior year. You can now allocate that to certain purposes. We have a free cash policy that looks at putting that to reserves, putting that to OPEB, again, knowing that future cost is out there, and then using only a small portion. Maintaining a high school construction fund. As the mayor will tell you, this city has invested heavily in high schools and looks to do so in the future. You think about North High School, the Tech School, South, Doherty, and the proposal to redo Burncoat. Those are incredibly expensive projects. Burncoat alone right now is anticipated to be a $500 million project. That is a huge project. It includes Burncoat Middle and High. The state, through the Mass School Business Association, Mass School Business Administration, will potentially pay up to 50% of that cost. So that means about $250 million that the city has to prepare for. But that's a major item. That's over $20 million a year that we would pay on debt service just related to that school. So again, as you think about our budget, we have to be able to absorb a $20 million cost in the future someday to be able to afford that high school. So putting monies aside now, generating interest, generating a fund that can help offset some of those costs in the future, and then committing new growth above budget to the unused tax levy capacity. When we create our budget, we have to make assumptions about new growth, new properties, new values that are coming online that increase the tax base beyond where it was when we set the original budget. We make an estimate. If any monies are generated above that estimate, if values come in above that estimate, the financial integrity plan says we will not tax that amount. So instead, that goes to what's called the unused tax levy capacity. It's monies that are put aside. And if in the future the city had to touch that, under the law it could, but on a year-over-year basis, the city doesn't tax to the max. That money remains in that unused tax levy capacity. And therefore, the tax rates are a little bit lower, the tax bills are a little bit lower. Right now, we have the 8th highest unused tax levy capacity in the state. Ours is about 25 million. To give an example, the city of Boston has essentially zero unused tax levy capacity. They tax to the maximum amount every single year. So our budget. This year, the original budget, again, the spring budget versus the fall budget. The spring budget was an $893 million budget. You can go online and look at our budget document. $893 million. I mentioned that there were 3 funding sources for the budget. The state governor's budget is where we build our numbers. It was a 5.4% increase in education funding last year, coming into this year, and a 3% increase in local aid. Locally, our taxes, property taxes, went up by 4.9%. That's 10 point. Does everybody remember Proposition 2.5? You remember that discussion? So Proposition 2.5 limits the overall increase in taxes by 2.5% each year. And so that 10.1 million indicates the 2.5% increase year over year. The 7.5 million represents that new growth I talked about, taxes that were not anticipated, values that were not anticipated. We budgeted for 7.5 million. Again, anything over budget, we put to the unused tax levy capacity. Ultimately, new growth was about 9.4 million, I think, last year. So the difference went to unused tax levy capacity, but we budgeted 7.5. And then local receipts, we assumed a 7.3% increase, driven, honestly, largely by interest rates. The city has money. It has about $400 million in various accounts. We're constantly spending and taking in money along the way. We're a major organization. We have about $1 billion budget. That money we put in accounts. Those accounts generate interest. That we did not predict the increases of interest rates over the last 2 years and kind of the excess revenues that those alone generated. But we assumed in this case going into 25 a 7.3% increase. So we're trying to take advantage of that. So here are the revenues. In their absolute, 396 million is coming from property tax, 52 million coming from state aid for local city aid, 387 million coming for schools, education aid, and then 56 million coming from local receipts. And you can see the sources, local receipts, especially motor vehicle excise tax, hotel and meals tax, license and permits, trash fees, fines and forfeitures, other fees and income, and like I mentioned, interest falls into that other fees and income. And here's how the budget spends it. $533 million to the public schools. That includes both the Worcester Public Schools and charter schools, as well as special ed and out-of-district costs. $165 million to what we term fixed costs, things like debt service, health insurance, intergovernmental obligations, things that we have very little to no control over. $113 million to public safety, police, fire, emergency communications, which is 911. If you call 911, you're calling a city department, as well as inspectional services. $23 million to public works. That includes streets, sidewalks, parks, and then $58 million to all other city operations. So you think public library, health and human services, economic development, administration and finance, and kind of general operations of the city, law, human resources, and the like. How does this look like scaled? Each of these boxes are in about the size of the component of the budget. You can see the blue here is education. Education is about 60% of the budget. And then if you go across, police, fire, debt service, public works, health insurance are kind of the big elements. And you can see how quickly things get crowded down to that smaller section of where the municipal budget goes. So then in the fall, budget adjustments. We came in with about $28 million of new revenue. It included a little bit of a difference in local aid once the state budget was approved, a little bit of a difference in education aid. I mentioned new growth came in over budget by about $2.2 million, and then free cash, monies from the prior fiscal year that got carried forward, were unexpended, was about $25 million. Of that amount, they were distributed between schools, stabilization accounts, the OPEB trust, again, planning for the future, the unused tax levy capacity. And then this year we did something unusual, which was we split the remainder between the Worcester Public Schools and the city. I mentioned we had about 10.7% reserves. We were above our reserve target of 10%. So we didn't put additional funds towards bond rating stabilization this year. Instead, we turned it toward operating for both city and schools. This is the capital budget. So that's all about the operating budget, then the capital budget. The capital budget is for big, major investments that require borrowing. The city does not have unlimited resources. It cannot afford to build a new building out of its operating budget. And so we go to the bond market. We don't go to a bank. We issue bonds. Those bonds are bought by various shareholders. They then give the city the funds, the city invests those funds, and then owes interest back to the bondholders over the course of 25 years. We had about $135 million borrowing budget for 2025. A large part of that relates to Doherty High School, $41 million for Doherty High School. Water and sewer, $21 million and $19 million. Those aren't paid by the taxes. Again, those are paid by water fees and sewer fees. And then up top, the tax levy component incorporates all of things like streets, sidewalks, vehicles, the things that the city needs to do on a daily basis. So just a quick note about education funding. I've touched on it. Education funding is set by Chapter 70 of the Mass General Laws. And what that does is it says there's an adequate amount of spending that must be made for every school child. And it's based on a lot of factors. Things like poverty, first of all, number of students, poverty levels, diversity levels of the community, the children with special needs, all the things that can affect the quality of an education or the cost of an education. That sets what's called the foundation budget. The foundation budget says this is what each community must spend based on all those factors for its education. Minimum amount. Then they determine what is the local required contribution. The local required contribution looks at the city of Worcester and says, you've got money, you have property values, you have wealth in the community. This is the number we say you must spend from your own resources, your own budget on education. That determines the amount we have to put in our budget from the city. Then there's actual contribution, which I'll talk about actually in a second. The difference, let me jump back up. The difference between the local contribution and the foundation budget, so what we can afford versus what we're told we must spend, that's what becomes state aid. So the state fills in the difference between what they say we can afford and what they say we have to spend. The challenge has been for us as a kind of on the municipal side, so on the school side, it provides a very high level of predictability, right? They know exactly how much they are going to get, and the city has to make up the difference to make sure that number is met. The challenge relates to net school spending. Certain monies that the city provides to the schools don't qualify as school spending. So buses, for example, that's the large one. Transportation to and from, that money doesn't count toward the formula. So there's about, I think it's up to like $40 million off. No, it's probably $30 million off the top that is transportation funding that doesn't count towards school spending. Especially when you think of the city of Worcester has to send certain students with special needs out of district for certain services, that cost comes off the top. Rentals, any cost that the schools spend on rentals doesn't count towards their net school spending. And so the result is we could meet actual contribution. The amount of money we give to the schools meets the required contribution. But when you look at the net, take off transportation, take off rentals, take off crossing guards don't count towards net school spending. The city can fall below its net school spending requirements. And that's where we've been the last 3 years. We've been below the net school spending requirements as a result of those offsets. This year, part of our goal and expectation is that by contributing that free cash component, we will be back above net school spending, but it's going to be a tricky kind of determination each year in terms of here's the money we contribute, how much comes off during the year, and then where does that leave us at the end of a year in terms of whether or not the city has met its net school spending. And so you'll hear that often discussed publicly as well, the city didn't meet net school spending. And the hardest part about that is you can't predict that in advance. You can only look backward to say, how are those monies spent? Did they qualify? And therefore, where are we at the end of the year? So there is going to be a education committee meeting on school spending that I'll be at and the CFO from the schools are going to be at, and we're going to talk about this if anybody's interested. I think March 31st. So you can see, actually, let me just talk about the charts really quickly. You can see on the right-hand top side, that's the City of Worcester's foundation budget. You can see how high it's been increasing, the rate of increase over the last 10 years. You can see the local required contribution is also going up over the last 10 years. One thing that, according to DESE, according to the census, and I'm sure not everybody feels it, but Worcester is becoming more valuable. It's becoming wealthier. Property values are going up, incomes are going up, and as a result, the local contribution continues to go up. So Worcester education funding, I mentioned it's about 60% of the budget. Our budget as a city increased 3%, but the education budget increased 5.2%. Obviously, that means things are crowded out. When our budget goes up 3%, but schools goes up at a higher rate, it means there's less on the municipal side we're able to do with that discretionary funding. The foundation budget has increased $122 million, or 31% over the 5 years. The local contribution increased $23 million, or 22% over the last 5 years. In 25 this year, the public schools general fund budget is $485 million, which is a $24 million increase. Their 26 preliminary budget, it hasn't been approved yet, has gone up again. So one thing the schools are benefiting from right now is the Student Opportunity Act, which was a state law passed to increase funding for education across the Commonwealth. And so for a period of about 7 years, you'll see significant increases in education funding here in Worcester, which is a good thing. And so the Worcester Public Schools general fund budget has increased almost $114 million, or 30% over the last 5 years. And just the graphic on the top right is Worcester's year-over-year increase in local contribution. You can see there a couple years where it was low, but this has been a huge kind of consideration in building the budget each year because the education cost is going up so much. But then on the bottom right, you can see our net school spending. And again, even though our contribution is going up because of offsets, the cost of transportation are going up. Schools has had to lease more properties lately. Those are all offset. That means net school spending numbers are underwater. And you can just see here's non-net school spending, the things that hit that number. It includes transportation is in blue, that's the big one. Charter school transportation in orange, so blue is the Worcester Public Schools transportation, orange is charter school. Building rentals in yellow, those are the big things that hit. So taxes, everybody likes to talk about taxes. City of Worcester tax levy. So when we build the tax levy every year, again, we look at what was the base from the prior year, what is a 2.5% increase allowed under the law, and then what new value do we anticipate coming into that base over the course of the year. And Worcester, great in many ways, not so great for property owners who see their house value go up, but their incomes not go up at a commensurate amount, is Worcester has been increasing significantly in value. 9% the last 2 years each year, 13% the year before that. People's home values keep going up and going up and going up. So the value of the city of Worcester right now is $24 billion. If you were going to buy Worcester, that's what it would cost. It's interesting to think there are some people who could afford that. That's an increase of 9.5% over the prior fiscal year. And you can see about a large part of that value is residential. When we tax properties in Worcester, it's divided by certain classes: residential, commercial, industrial, personal property, tax exempt. Residential is the large part of Worcester's tax base, and it's been growing. Commercial values have gone down a bit, not like in Boston. I don't know if anybody's read the articles in Boston over the whole fight where the mayor was trying to push more value, more tax onto commercial properties versus residential, but Worcester's has gone down a bit. So almost $20 billion in residential, about $3 billion in commercial, less than $1 billion in industrial, and then about $1.3 in personal property. Personal property is largely utilities, telephone poles, cables under the street. That is not taxed as commercial property because they don't own the property; they own the cable. They own the pole. They own the wires, but they don't own the property underneath. So that's taxed as personal property. And then about $7.2 billion in tax-exempt value. You'll hear the discussion of pilots come up frequently. Much of that tax-exempt value is actually government. We own property in the city. We do. The state does. That's where you see a lot of tax-exempt value. Second highest, I believe, is churches. There's a lot of churches in the city. They are not taxed. Therefore, it comes off the top. Third is colleges and universities, and you'll often hear the focus about pilots or payments in lieu of taxes, some kind of agreement, a voluntary payment by institutions that are tax exempt but have resources to contribute to the city. New growth value was $452 million this last year. Value, the taxes were lower than that, obviously, but most of that new growth, about 40% in residential, about 25% commercial industrial, and about 40% in personal property. And then the unused tax levy capacity, again, I mentioned that where we don't tax that we're allowed to under the law is about 26 million. So the tax rate process. I highly encourage you to watch the tax rate process as it goes through City Council. It's very interesting. It's a vote no one wants to take, but it's essentially looking at, we know what our levy needs to be. One of the interesting things about the way local government is structured in Massachusetts is we don't have to question how much we raise in taxes. We only have to question who pays that bill, because the law dictates how much the taxes can go up year over year and what that amount would be. So in this case, it's a $399,910,848 levy. The levy being, this is what we will tax all properties in the city of Worcester. Now we have to look at, so where is that tax assessed? How much is assessed against residential? How much is assessed against commercial? How much is against industrial? How much is against personal? In Worcester and in most communities, it's a dual tax rate, meaning there's a residential rate and then there's a commercial, industrial, personal property rate. And so the council's charge, and it is a difficult one, is to look at the thousandth of a rate to say, where do you assess those fees? How much of that amount is absorbed by the residential taxpayer versus how much is absorbed by the commercial? There is a maximum and a minimum under state law. The maximum in terms of The maximum that can be shared is the single tax rate. If there's a single tax rate, every single property would pay the same amount on its dollar value. So if you had a more valuable property, you will pay more in taxes, but you will pay, $10 per thousand of value, similar to a resident that would pay $10,000 per thousand of value. That's that first line. That line goes down into the hundreds. And in the bottom of that line is the lowest amount that you can shift the property tax burden from residential onto commercial. And Worcester, and this, I won't even spend much time on this, but there's lots of considerations. How much is everybody going up? Are they going up in equal amount? Are they going up in equal percent? Commercial versus residential. Where are they both going up versus one is going down? So there's a lot of considerations that go into that. The selected tax rate, if you look at this, the yellow line is the single tax rate. If everybody had the same tax bill amount, that same number that was assessed against them in terms of the tax rate, that would be that orange line. The dotted blue line is the lowest amount you can shift onto the commercial property. The orange line is the line that the city has adopted each year. And you can see in most years, the city's tax rate is very close to shoving most of it onto commercial property owners. That results in, you can see the blue line here is the percent of the city that is commercial, but the orange line represents the amount of the taxes that those properties pay. And you can see, while in the latest year, commercial properties made up just over 20% of the value in the city, they paid about 37% of the taxes in the city as a result of that tax shift. It's a difficult challenge, it's a difficult decision, but it has to be made under state law every single year. A tax rate has to be set. Once that's set, we're able to issue the January tax bill, which is called the actual tax bill, because your January bill includes your actual value for that fiscal year and the actual tax rate for that fiscal year. You'll notice the bills you get in July and then October are simply a math equation based on the prior year. Those are called preliminary tax bills. The actual tax bills make up for whatever difference there might be in the spring billings, third and fourth quarter. I'll just mention one other item here on kind of the taxes, which is the Community Preservation Act. I'm sure all of you or many of you have seen that bill that comes as well. That's a result of a referendum, a public referendum under state law that occurred in November of 22. It assessed a 1.5% surcharge on property taxes on the tax bill. There are exemptions that were approved, low-income owner-occupied housing, $100,000 value of all property. So when we do that calculation, the first $100,000 comes off, and $100,000 of commercial and industrial property. That money raised locally is matched from a state fund at about 20%. And the purposes of that are affordable housing, open space, and historic preservation. I'm sure Peter could talk about it a little bit more. Economic development staffs the Community Preservation Act Committee. The decisions on where those dollars go are done by a city board. Again, the mayor mentioned joining city boards and committees. That's one you could get on and help determine where the CPA funds go. In 24, the average bill for a single family was only $56. The average commercial bill was about $500. It made a total commitment, a total kind of assessment out of about $4.2 million. And then the state matched it by about $764,000. Just another item to note in terms of organization, collective bargaining. As the city looks to build its budgets, we have to look at what agreements have been made, what commitments to various unions. On the city side, we have 6 unions plus unrepresented employees. On the schools side, they have more than 20, I think. 5 is 16, so maybe 16 various unions. Right now, all of the city's unions have agreements. On the schools side, they're still missing 5. That's not atypical. A lot of times, union agreements can often follow their expiration dates as various negotiations take place. But this always has to be a consideration of what is actually agreed to and what might be agreed to. If there's an open contract, what might be agreed to in that future year that you have to plan for. And so in years where there are open contracts, we often put significant funds in contingency to have available for when those agreements are made, when new salary changes are implemented and what that might mean for the city budget. Fixed obligations, this is just my nightmare. I've been sharing it as often, as loudly as I can, but this is the city's future as it relates to costs that we can expect going forward. The various elements make, and this is just kind of core elements, but the blue down the bottom represents existing debt service, monies we owe out. The green represents Worcester Public Schools related debt service. That debt service, just to talk about school funding, that debt service does not count toward net school spending. So the city spent over $20 million on debt related to the schools last year. It didn't count to the formula in terms of whether or not the city spent sufficient funds on education. Orange relates to future anticipated debt service. The light blue is health insurance. The small yellow bands there are pension obligation bonds. The city borrowed money to pay pensions back in 1997. We're just paying off those bonds. The orange are retirement pension obligations that we have. You can see a significant drop in 2034. We're required to be fully funded on pensions by 2040. The city is on a funding plan to be fully funded by 2034. So you can see the two drops of those initial 10 years. The first drop is when the pension obligation bonds are completed, and the early debt, we do 5-year debt for equipment, that drops off. The second drop relates to the full funding of retirement, at which point we will continue to put money in for current workers. For example, Peter or I, money will go in to pay for our future retirement, but people who are already retired will be fully paid for out of that fund. That fund has over $500 million in it right now. Once we get there, that fund will generate its sufficient income to pay for all retirees, and the city won't pay for a retiree, they'll pay for people working who will ultimately become retirees. So here's our pension obligation funding. You can see the drop-off where 2035 will be a good year. So actually, sorry, I misspoke. Our assets right now in the retirement system are $1.3 billion. We have a liability of $1.7 billion, so that's the number we have to get to for full funding. Right now, we spend, I think in FY25, we put in something like $65 million went towards pension as part of our contribution and effort to get up to that full funding. OPEB. OPEB, similar to pension, is a future liability. Someday we will be retirees. Someday we will have health insurance costs. So our full liability is about $1.15 billion. Under law, we do not have to have that fully funded. We have to illustrate that. We have to record it, but it does not have to be funded yet. However, the city recognizes that is coming home to roost someday. All those health insurance costs will exist in the future as various people retire, and health insurance goes up, the number of employees or retirees will go up, and therefore we need to be prepared. So the city has a OPEB trust fund. We put monies aside in that trust fund with a goal that someday, it's very small right now comparatively, it's about $50 million, but that someday that trust fund, similar to the pension fund, can pay the cost of all retirees' health insurance so that the city's contribution is just for current employees and their future expected health insurance needs. And then debt. Debt is a major consideration we go through every year, how to bond, whether to bond, what that might cost us. We get rated by the 3 bond rating agencies, Fitch, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's. We are considered good bonds. We're not perfect. AAA is perfect. Boston is a AAA. Cambridge is a AAA. We're in various elements, AA, AA3, AA-, but that's in that top level of bonds. Our goal is to get to a AAA because you pay less in interest. You're a more guaranteed investment if you're AAA, so your interest costs go down, which means our operating impact will go down. So we meet with the bond rating agencies every year, talk about how the city's doing, how our finances are doing, how our economic development is going. Bond ratings are affected by reserves, the amount of money we have in reserves. That 10% is an item they look at. If we had a reduction in reserves, they might think we're not prepared for the emergency that could come, and therefore we're a bad investment, a risky investment. The unused tax levy capacity is essentially a reserve. If the city had to tap it, it could. They look at our assessed values, per capita earnings. They look at our liabilities, pensions, OPEB, like how is that in terms of the city's future and its risk. Our debt status, this is as of June 30th, the end of the last fiscal year, but we had about $1 billion in debt. That is a lot of debt. You can see some of it is considered self-funding, which is it has a funding source committed to it, separate and apart from the annual budget process. Water and sewer, enterprise accounts, I mentioned. Pilot pays for some of the library improvements, the school funds that we have, the ballpark, the district improvement financing structure that's built for the ballpark and for City Square. So of that $1 billion debt, about $400 million of it is an obligation of the annual operating budget that we're only paying the debt service, not the total liability, but it's kind of the weight of that is on our considerations each year. So future budget constraints, where education goes, again, we do not determine the amount of money due to schools, due to education. So how that's determined at the state level, what that year-over-year growth might look like is something we have to consider as we look to build future budgets. And the demands of school and city replacement projects, the talk of Burncoat, middle and senior high school, repairs that need to be made on the police station, the DPW, all those things are significant considerations. Personnel commitments, collective bargaining. If you bargain an increase in compensation, that's a cost that you will see for multiple years. You have to accommodate that in multiple years. Increasing subscriptions. We live in a world that's not based on kind of a simple purchase and ownership from that point forward. Even our financial system, after 30 years, our financial system is going from a 2001 Space Odyssey-like server sitting at tech services into a cloud-based system. That's a subscription, that costs money. Fixed costs, the pension obligation increases, health insurance increases, debt service obligations, and then the financial integrity plan itself, our commitment to putting aside reserves, to making sure that we have the basic kind of foundation for our budgets. And then last but not least, just because this has been talked about so frequently lately, federal funding and the city's dependency on federal funding. City and schools receive funding separately, I mean, through the city, but we receive separate sources of funding. On the city side, we have about $54 million. Much of that, however, are funds that we distribute. The city does not generally operate on federal funding. Those are things like community development block grant, home funds, emergency solutions grants, monies that the city gives out toward nonprofits and other entities in the city. The big one that the city is dependent on for right now is a SAFER grant. SAFER is Staffing for Adequate Fire and Emergency Response. We have 2 SAFER grants that help pay for new fire classes that come on. That means that the city doesn't absorb the cost of those new classes for a period of 3 years. That grant absorbs it. That would be a $23 million impact if that were to be removed. But in large part, for FY25, it's about $10 million of our budget is based on federal funding sources, and it's about 92 positions in part. They're people who are partially funded by various grants. Schools, however, about $54 million of the school's budget is based on federal grants, and the school's grants are for operations. Those are things they use to address low-income families and issues, disability issues, child nutrition, Head Start. This is information pulled directly from the school budget, but for FY25, $54 million in the school budget, and about 779 positions are dependent on federal aid. So as there's kind of this talk of what might happen with federal funding, will grants get canceled? How will they impact various organizations? The city would be hurt. The schools would be struggling. They would have a major impact on core elements of what they do without federal funds. So we will obviously have to pay attention to that both for the remainder of this fiscal year and future fiscal years. Other federal funding, just you might hear talked about, American Rescue Plan Act or ARPA funds. The city received $146 million back in 2021 related to COVID and kind of the return from COVID. It might have been 22. CARES Act were monies that we received during COVID. Those are now expended. ESSER funding were monies the schools received from during COVID. That's now expended. The state has American Rescue Plan Act money, of which the city can benefit from various infrastructure projects or the like that the state undertakes within the city. And then the federal infrastructure bill committed about $9.5 billion to Massachusetts. The city doesn't receive those funds, but it could go towards various projects within the city. So as we look at kind of federal changes, those are things we have to think about in terms of those potential impacts. So that'll all be on the test. I hope you took good notes. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I mean, the key is this is complicated. There's a lot to it. And it's always difficult to explain it. And so, you know, you'll see little pieces of it go throughout the year through the council process, but this kind of tries to tie all of it into one. But yes.
Slide 20. Oh, thank you. Slide 23.
I'm sorry?
Slide 23.
Slide 23.
Yep. To the
Yes.
extent that you can share, the orange, what would be examples of that, and why is it increasing so much over time?
So orange would be primarily things like streets, sidewalks, vehicle purchases, park investments, city building investments. They're capital projects or capital purchases that the city would undertake. We're assuming this is based, that's an estimate, right? That's not a guarantee. We're estimating a $65 million budget annually that increases by 3% a year. So you're just seeing kind of the growth of the capital budget and then the impact on the debt service that would come with that. But debt is expensive. We actually issued our latest bond. We bid our latest bond today, and it's the highest interest rate, which is bad for the city. It means we pay more since 2017. So interest rates on the bond market are high, and, you know, lots change over the course of that year. In 2020 and 2021, we were about 1.5%. Today's was 3.6%. So there's a lot of unknowns as you look towards the future. So that one is based on just 65 million, 3% growth over the year, and I think we used a 4% interest rate for the duration. So, yep. Yep.
How many employees does the city have? Oh, sorry. How many employees does the city have?
So on the city side, it's, and my eyes aren't that good, but it's about 1,500. Those are city employees, and then on the schools side, 4,800, for a total here of about almost 7,000. That number's not 100% accurate because there's lots of temporary staff that come in and out on various points, especially on the schools side. We, you know, and for the city, you know, we have summer parks employees. You know, on the school side, they have substitute teachers. You know, they have various people who come in and out during the course of school year, coaches and things like that. So I think, you know, generally between 7,500 employees is where the city is about right now.
So thinking about the pension, how long do these employees stick around? What's the average tenure?
That's a good
And when do they
question.
vest in their pension?
Yeah, so under the state system, this is defined by state law, it's 10 years before you before you vest in the pension system. I don't have I can only give you an anecdotal answer to that, which is, I think we're seeing a transition, right? Over the last few years, my impression, you had longer-term employees who started work in the early 2000s, the 1990s and 1980s, who tended to stay for the full duration. I think now kind of the new generation isn't interested or doesn't value the idea of a pension, and so I think you're seeing people pass through more quickly. One thing about the state pension system is it carries to any city or town in Massachusetts as well as the state, so you could see people leave the Worcester pension system, go to the state, or go to Millbury, or go to Shrewsbury, and they remain vested or in the opportunity to vest, but it won't show up on our books. It'll show up on the receiving community's books. So, there was another question in the back. Oh, sure, sorry.
Are the bond interest rates, are those fixed throughout the term, or do they fluctuate?
Yes, no, they're fixed.
They're fixed. And I remember, I think this was a couple of months ago, there was some, should we say, discussions in the media when WPI bought those two hotels, and
Yes.
that affected the tax levy, from what I gather. How does the city then replace that? How do you look to that?
So that's a really good question. So what happens there, what made that acquisition so complicated is hotels generate multiple revenues for the city. There's the general property tax, which any building in any location would generate, assuming it's not tax exempt. But then because it's a hotel, there's also the hotel meals tax, which comes on top of that. In this case, there was a third element because it goes tax exempt completely. So it's not just one property was bought out from a hotel to some other use, meaning we'd still have the property tax. We lost the property tax, we lost the hotel tax, and that hotel tax, one half of that was part of the funding that goes to the DCU Center. There is a state law that allows certain revenues generated by certain hotels to help fund improvements at the DCU, and one of those hotels happened to be one of them. The agreement that the city reached with WPI is that they will stay, first of all, they're open as hotels right now. And as long as they are open and operating at hotels, as hotels, they are fully taxable. Just because WPI owns it, it does not change that fact. It's only when WPI begins using them for academic use, that's when they would become tax exempt. They've agreed to continue the obligation from the year before they become tax exempt up through, I think it's 2029, essentially on one. The other, they're going to keep operating through 2030, and then they're subject to a general pilot through 2034. So it is not necessarily going to be a short-term impact. It is going to be a longer-term impact when those agreements expire. But what would happen is the city would do its valuation. If those hotels come out, our tax base could go down a little bit by the loss of that building value if it becomes tax exempt. And it will either impact the overall levy of what we can raise, or if the levy is still there, it will disperse the value of those taxes to other property owners. Other taxpayers will have to cover that loss year over year. So, but for now, like as of today, as of next year, there's been no impact as long as they're continuing to operate as hotels.
I have two questions related to real estate taxes. On the commercial and manufacturing tax rate, which I understand is double or more than the residential rate and higher than neighboring communities. So, right, there's a real concern. If I'm a new business, am I going to do that in Shrewsbury and pay half or less than half of the real estate taxes than I would pay in Worcester? Do we hit, is there economic projection expertise out there that says, let's say Worcester lowered that commercial tax rate? So now you look, we're getting, less in taxes. On the other hand, presumably we would get, with some kind of a lag, more economic activity. And presumably there'd be sort of knock-on effects. There'd be maybe more sales taxes or other kind of economic activity in the city. Is there, sort of valid, reliable economic consulting either that the city does or accesses to see whether, we could lower the taxes and it would sort of pay for itself?
Right. Unfortunately, no. And I can tell you, as the former executive director of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau, which wrote a report on that, to try to figure out, is there a way of measuring impact of the tax rate? There's really not good data. Part of the challenge is citing a commercial property is location dependent in so many cases, right? If you're trying to sell, especially like think of a restaurant, if you're trying to sell food to people, you need to be where the people are, no matter what the cost is. If you need a large tract of land, you need to go where large tracts of land are located. That might not be in a city. And so it's really hard to kind of find the but-for case where this property would have been used except for taxes, therefore this property was used instead. The other piece to consider is the first part of your comment. I don't know that that's necessarily true. When you think about tax rates are based on property values. And property values in Worcester are generally lower than in any of the surrounding communities. So while our tax rate is higher, I'm talking residential right now. While our tax rate is higher on the residential side, we actually pay less taxes than all the surrounding communities as on average, except for Leicester. Because if you think of Shrewsbury and Holden and even Auburn and Boylston, the property values there are so much beyond Worcester, they're paying far more in taxes than you are individually as homeowners in Worcester. Again, commercial, it's harder to draw that connection because Worcester has such bigger commercial entities than a Shrewsbury or a Boylston or a Paxton that you can't really say the commercial rate is skewing one way or another. Do I think it has an impact? Yes. I think there are absolutely some businesses that might look at tax rates and say, well, I'm not going to go there. But I think, and Peter Dunn could speak to this when he talks to you about economic development, I think by and large, that's not the primary consideration for most businesses. I think, does it have access? Does it have the quality of space that they're looking for? Does it have kind of the customer base they need or the infrastructure to get to the customer base they need? On the periphery, you might see some choices being made, but I don't know that it's the only choice. I will say, and I'll let Peter talk about this one in more detail, the way the city works to try to combat that effort, that perception, is through the tax increment financing program and various economic development tools we have. And there's always that kind of concern about those products, but they are controlled by state law and they can only go towards new businesses coming in or businesses expanding. They can't be used for existing businesses. So there's a inherent kind of conflict there between the existing taxpayer and a potential new taxpayer, but they do allow us to offset some of the potential tax impact to a new taxpayer or expanding taxpayer in the city.
Thank you. That's a great answer. One more question on the real estate. We have all these tax-exempt entities that own real estate, and I'm guessing that, let's say some of the schools have, land that's used for classes, what I would call a tax-exempt purpose, but then they may have some land that is just vacant, and maybe land used as a hotel, I'm hearing, or something used some other way, which just doesn't seem like it's a tax-exempt purpose. Shouldn't they pay regular real estate taxes on the land that is not used for a tax-exempt purpose? Is that how it works?
Yes. So if the tax-exempt entity has to submit each year to the city assessor what's called the 3ABC, and that document indicates all the properties they own and justifies why it is a tax-exempt property. There are a number of properties in the city that are owned by tax-exempt entities that pay full taxes. I know Holy Cross has a number of residential properties it purchased that they pay taxes on. WPI has a few, I think. And again, the hotels, WPI is paying full taxes right now on them. Clark, I think, has a couple. A tax-exempt entity has 2 years after purchase to convert a property to a tax-exempt use. If they do not, it becomes fully taxable from that until that purpose changes. So if they just buy a vacant lot and sit on it, they will pay taxes on that lot.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to do, if it's okay with you, 2 more questions, and then we'll do like a 3-minute break for restrooms, and then we'll dive into economic development. Okay?
Thank you. My question has to do with the $100 million debt services fee that you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
I want to know whether the $100 million is inclusive of any payment towards the liability, or is just a fee?
It's not addressing, I mean, it's only addressing the liability in the sense as you pay off your debt principal, the liability will come down, but it's paying your credit card bill. So your credit card bill includes both some of your base and the interest they're charging you. Each time we pay debt service, we're covering a little bit of the principal and a little bit of the interest on each bond. And so over time, it will cover that whole liability. But of course, in the meantime, every year we're generating new liability by borrowing additional funds for new projects. So that debt service isn't addressing that bottom number except on the margins.
Thank you.
All right, and our last question before a wiggle break.
Hi, I just want to circle back to the exempt taxes with the colleges, and I was just wondering, like, when did that come into fruition that they were exempt on taxes for property? Because I grew up in Maine South. Clark University used to do a lot of work in the back of Clark and not in the front on the Main Street side until couple decades later, they started to do something with University Park. But is there a way that we can hold them accountable to pay their appropriate taxes? I mean, they're bringing in billions of dollars, and I really think they should be held accountable to, at least pitch in for the city, or if not the community, what they're in. You know what I'm saying? So how can we help you do that?
Change state law, change federal law. So we have no control at the local level. We cannot require a tax-exempt entity to pay taxes. But I will point out, just on the Main Street side, if you think about it, I am 99% sure, like the Anthony's Clark Brunch building that Clark owns, they pay taxes on that because it's not being used for university purposes at this point. What we do is we create these pilot agreements. We go to the colleges, we talk to them about the impact, and Clark has a pilot. Pilot stands for payment in lieu of taxes. They don't have to pay taxes, so they pay a payment in lieu of taxes. Clark, WPI, Mass College of Pharmacy, who am I missing? Clark? Holy Cross. Clark, WPI, Mass College of Pharmacy have agreements where they pay 20% of any new acquisition. They'll contribute that amount as a payment in lieu of taxes. What they would have owed as taxes if it were remaining on the tax rolls. Holy Cross has an agreement where they pay the city $80,000 a year to support Libby, the bookmobile, but they don't have necessarily a property acquisition pilot. The city council's been calling and talking about this issue for many years, calling on the colleges and universities to step forward. The city manager is talking to the colleges and universities about expanding the pilot program, kind of improving it. There are examples from other cities that have been successful in getting their college communities to contribute more, nonprofit communities. Boston now sends a bill to all their nonprofits that request that they pay 25% of their value over a certain amount. Not all of them do it, but some of them do it. Brown, Providence College, Roger Williams, I think Johnson & Wales, all recently made a single agreement with the city of Providence to pay pilots based on certain factors. It actually wasn't too different from what we have individually, but it was a good deal for Providence to lock that in. So it's still discussion. Under state law, our rights are limited, college rights are protected. We continue to have these conversations to see what they can offer and what we think we can get.
All right, thank you. Tim, thank you so much for coming.
Now we have Peter Dunn, who's the Chief Development Officer here in the City of Worcester, the Economic Development Office. There's a lot of different moving parts in that office. He's been there for 5 years as the chair of that, Chief Development Officer. Before that, so he's been with the city about 12 years. So he's done a great job for the city. Please welcome Peter Dunn.
Thank you, Mayor Petty. Good evening, everybody. It's good to be here with you. Before we get started, I also just wanted to start by thanking you for your participation in this. I know it's not easy to dedicate that time out of your life, not only today, but in the future sessions, to learn about these kinds of topics, but it is critically important. We always could use more civically engaged residents, so having folks that are informed on some of these complex topics is also really important, so that if you do decide to get engaged in some way, whether it's running for elected office or serving on a board or commission, or even just participating in public engagement processes, having some knowledge about some of these complex topics is really important. So thank you all for doing that. So one of the things I wanted to actually start with was just a little bit of an exercise, if you don't mind indulging me, is, you hear the term economic development and it's a dense topic. We can go in a lot of different directions with the conversation tonight. And sometimes it's a little bit amorphous of like, what are we referring to when we talk about economic development? So first, I just wanted to kind of hear from you all, if you would be kind of willing to share, when you think about economic development or hear that term, what is your impression of that? What does that mean to you? What do you think it entails?
Trying to market the city.
Marketing the city, yep. In the back. Okay.
Grow the financial base of the city, so everything spreads out from there. More money to spend.
Growing the tax base, yep. In the back? John? Making more money? Yes. Increasing the value? Anybody else? Well, we do have a mission statement for my department. I wasn't going to do the vision statement for you, but kind of rather share some like goals and kind of higher themes about what kind of we do every day, what economic development is. There's a lot of kind of overlapping functions, a lot of different kinds of goals or outcomes that we want to see from it. And specifically, I'll tailor it then to like, what is the role of the municipality? How do we do that? Because economic development is really an ecosystem of not just the municipality or the public sector, but also the private sector and others as well. So I'll speak a little bit to like, what do we do every day? What is the role of the municipality in that ecosystem? So thinking about employment and business, so wanting to make sure that we have living wage jobs for our residents. It's great when people want to live here, they grow up here, maybe new people are coming into the city, they want to be here for a variety of reasons. That's great. We like to see folks coming into the city or folks growing up here, and we want to make sure that we have living wage jobs for those folks that live here. We don't want to be a bedroom community. We don't want people to have to go somewhere else for their place of employment. We want to make sure that we have those living wage jobs right here in the city of Worcester for our residents. Thinking about also related to that employment, how do we create economic mobility for folks and wealth creation? So how do we not just get you into, you know, a job, but also a career pathway where you're building wealth over time for yourselves and your family, and being able to pass that on to other generations and seeing that kind of economic mobility through the ladders and seeing that growth throughout the stages of your career and increasing that income that you're able to generate through that employment. As we think about housing, we want to make sure that we have opportunities for different households. Not everybody's living situation or what they're desiring from their household living situation is the same. Some folks have a growing family. Some folks have a family where there's empty nesters, where they may have had children that have gone on to college, they've graduated, now they might not need a 4-bedroom single-family home. Maybe they have a different living situation based on, you know, the stage that they're in their life. Maybe you have just folks that are living alone. Maybe it's somebody that's recently graduated college or somebody that just, you know, lives alone or with roommates. And so we want to make sure that as we're thinking about the housing stock in the city, that it's a healthy housing stock, that in an older city like the city of Worcester, we have the majority of our housing stock that was built prior to 1980, and in times where there were different materials used like asbestos and lead paint. So making sure that we're investing in that existing housing stock, making it cleaner, making it healthier, reducing prevalence of asthma, some of those kind of living conditions. If you have lead paint, can lead to other, you know, public health outcomes, negative public health outcomes like asthma. And so investing in that stock, but also having a variety of options. You know, everybody thinks of like the classic 3-decker, a city of 3-deckers like Worcester and many other post-industrial cities or gateway cities in Massachusetts, but having different kinds of product types as well. You see some of the new construction happening in the city. You see conversion of older buildings. So we have, as a post-industrial city, the mill buildings of the city, that those mill buildings are no longer conducive to the modern days of manufacturing. So how do we put them into new productive uses, creating loft-style housing with exposed brick and beam, creating that interesting character. Creating different bedroom sizes, so studios and 1-bedrooms and 2-bedrooms and 3-bedrooms, single family, multifamily, home ownership in addition to rental. So we want to make sure that we're having a wide array of different housing typology, housing options for folks that addresses the various demographic trends and the needs that we want to see also addressed in the city. So that's critically important. Generally, investment, people had mentioned expanding the tax base or revenues, seeing that in the city. So yes, as Tim was mentioning, when the tax rate vote is set every year, very difficult vote, kind of a zero-sum game. Somebody's going to have to pay that share, the other half with the residential or commercial paying the other half of that share. We like to try to grow that pie. So rather than having that zero-sum game, there's a pie that needs to be distributed, having to also think about that new growth. So Tim talked about in the budget, there's always like a budget amount for new growth. As he mentioned, we've been exceeding that estimate over the last few years. Definitely proud of that. And so we want to try to take that pie, and rather than just focus on who gets the piece of that pie, we want to grow that pie so that we can do more for everybody, try to hold the line on taxes for everybody, but also be able to do more, make those investments as a city. So that ability to expand the tax base, that's really the lifeblood for everything that the city wants to do, as you heard about earlier. That helps us with the public investments that are necessary, but we also want to make sure that we're an attractive place for private investment. That's critically important as well. That helps us think about the productivity of the land that we have. So again, the theme of like post-industrial city where we do have these brownfield sites. You may have heard of the term brownfields. When a manufacturer leaves and you have that legacy that's left behind, whether it's a contaminated building, a contaminated piece of land, that's not good for anybody. It needs to be an attractive place so that we can have that private investment come, clean that up, put it into new productive uses, and have that piece of land contribute its potential to the tax base of the city. Because when you have that disinvestment that occurs, then you kind of have a vicious cycle, because when the disinvestment happens, then the property value is less, and then it creates a situation where the city can't get as much revenue from that land. And then, as Tim was talking about with the bond ratings, when the disinvestment happens, then we're getting lesser bond ratings, so the cost of our borrowing goes up. So it creates this kind of vicious cycle when you get into that trap of disinvestment. So it's a good, healthy thing to be attractive for private investment. Certainly, you want to try to manage that in a way that mitigates, other concerns or consequences like gentrification. There's no special sauce for, mitigating or dealing with gentrification, but trying to do the things that we can in the public sector to, pull different levers to try to manage that and make sure that our community, as the community is growing, how do our residents participate in that growth that's happening? So we have a variety of different kinds of programs or tools or strategies that we try to do to make sure that Worcester residents are participating in the economic development activity happening in the city, and really leading to one of these themes that's known as neighborhood stabilization. So I mentioned like investment versus disinvestment. Well, when you have a neighborhood and you have usually hopefully a commercial corridor in that neighborhood, Main South was referenced earlier, so you have a nice solid commercial corridor right on Main Street, and then you have the residential kind of uses that kind of come out from that commercial corridor. You want to have occupancy in those storefronts. You want to have those services that are needed for those residents, whether it's products, grocery services, making sure that we don't have food deserts in the city, making sure that there's access to financial institutions, having banks existing in our neighborhoods, and really having that investment and that occupancy, as I mentioned, in the building stock. Because when you have the vacancies and you have the disinvestment, it leads to that kind of vicious cycle that I was describing. So all that's kind of important and leads to ultimately quality of life. And when we think about quality of life, there's a lot of different departments that play a role in quality of life for a community. But one of the things that we do is try to manage what we call the built environment. So I'll talk a little bit more about zoning and those considerations, but really thinking about the built environment and how do we think about the investment that might be happening and steer that investment or shape that investment, how it kind of creates the built environment that we kind of live in every day, and trying to create environments where, again, people, if they're living here in the city, they can access their employment here in the city, they can access food and other needs right there in the neighborhood, and not have to get in personal vehicles and drive across the city, or hopefully not drive into other towns. We want to create that ecosystem that ultimately leads to that outcome that we see or want to see with quality of life. And you can kind of see, again, with the kind of cross-functional nature of what economic development is, it leads to us probably more so than other departments collaborating across departments in the city. So we work really closely with really each and every department in the city because of what we do has that cross-functional nature associated with it. So we're probably one of the bigger kind of facilitators or collaborators of all the departments in the city. So again, we can probably take this conversation in a lot of different directions. This is a big topic, and rather than go through a list of projects that are happening in the city, I don't really feel like that's very useful to you. We could probably talk for 2 hours about this housing project in this district or this new business coming over here. That's not really the approach that I wanted to take, even though there's a lot happening in that space. I'd rather kind of lay out who we are, what we do, and then see how that sparks a conversation later about what you want to learn more about. So we have a variety of divisions in the Economic Development Department. We have a variety of divisions. We have the Planning and Regulatory Services Division. So this is the division that really leads that built environment that I was talking about. Zoning, I'll talk more about that later, so I won't get into the details now, but zoning, as well as the relationship between land use in the city and transportation. How do people get around? How do people access, their place of employment? How do people access housing? How do people access, goods and services? And so how does that all happen within the framework of the built environment? And the zoning of the city is a key driver of that. You see a lot of talk happening across the Commonwealth right now and really beyond nationwide about zoning and some of the maybe poor decision-making of the past as it relates to zoning and where a lot of the best practices and thought leaders are trying to take municipalities and zoning frameworks into the 21st century. Housing Development Division. So we have a team of folks that work on both the existing housing stock, as I mentioned, keeping that investment happening in our existing housing stock. Some of it's very old. It needs to be tackled. There's a huge deferred maintenance problem in the city. So as you think about, all the things that people are trying to keep up with and the financial pressures of inflation and rising taxes and insurance and all of those things, we estimate right now the deferred maintenance that exists on residential properties in the city is in excess of $1 billion. And it's, quite frankly, sometimes that's just because people don't have the additional dollars available to make those investments that they might want to make, whether it's a new roof, whether it's upgrading kitchens and bathrooms, whether it's just kind of upgrading siding, things like that to keep up, because again, some of this building stock that we have is decades old, so it needs that maintenance ongoing. And then also the health considerations, as I mentioned too, making sure that we have more and more properties that have a lead paint abatement certificate. Right now it's less than 20%, so of the entire housing stock in the city of Worcester, we can only tell you for sure that about 20% does not have lead paint in it. We need to bring that number way up. So that's really important as it relates to the existing housing stock. We also need to focus on housing production. I'll talk more about that. That's a big topic right now. How do we produce more housing? That's an issue here in Worcester. It's an issue in the Commonwealth. It's an issue nationwide, that the housing production has not kept up with population growth, with the needs, and that supply issue is one of the key things that's driving rent increases, price increases on home ownership, sales, and the like. And so we need to come up with strategies to produce housing and produce it faster. And one of the culprits of that is zoning. So we'll talk more about that. So that's the housing division. We also have some specialty programs that our housing division does. We work closely with the community-based housing agencies in the city. So we partner with Worcester Community Housing Resources on down payment assistance. So trying to make sure that folks can access home ownership. As we know, home ownership is still single-handedly the most accessible way for families to build wealth. It's usually the most valuable asset that any household has is their home. So trying to make sure that we continue to have pathways for homeownership, and the down payment requirement can often be a barrier. So coming up with programs and having programs for down payment assistance is critically important. We work with a variety of other agencies like the Central Mass Housing Alliance, Friendly House, Worcester Community Action Council on rental assistance, and particularly during the last 5 years with the situation exacerbated by the pandemic, and using some of those federal resources that Tim described to have rental assistance programs, because as folks were either getting laid off because of the pandemic or struggling to keep up with all the inflation that we've seen and rising costs of interest rates and everything, folks falling behind on their rent. And one of the best things that we can do to prevent eviction is to help people stay current on their rent. So rather than dealing with when they get evicted and what do we do now, let's come up with these prevention strategies like rental assistance so that we can keep people where they are and stable in that place of where they are. So we have some specialty programs related to that. We also support some of the transitional housing and shelters in the city. We collaborate very closely with our Department of Health and Human Services on that. So our Health and Human Services Department does a little bit more on like the kind of outreach and the strategies around folks getting out of situations of homelessness and dealing with the mental health side of that or the addiction side of that in some cases. And so, but we focus on like the development side, so like the built environment again, as it relates to creating shelters or the operating expenses associated with shelters or transitional housing. So some of the federal dollars that we get, again, that Tim mentioned, can go towards what they call emergency solutions. So things like transitional shelter and temporary shelter. So we do some of those kinds of programs. We also then have a business development division. So really focusing on our business community. Both we deal with businesses that are, coming into the city. We deal with folks that are residents that are entrepreneurial and want to start their own business, but they're not sure how do I start my own business? What's an LLC? What's a corporation? What's a sole proprietorship? How will my business interact with the city? Do I need a permit? Do I need a license? Coming back to zoning, if I need a physical location, can I do what I want to do in that property or not? Or what are the requirements around that? So those types of things, as well as working with our existing businesses if they're growing. Maybe they need to find a site where they can expand. Maybe they're just trying to, in these days, just trying to survive, quite frankly. It's been a lot of a very challenging time for businesses. With the impacts of the pandemic, in the wake of the pandemic, there were a lot of resources available to businesses at the local, state, and federal level because of the pandemic impacts, but those dollars are largely gone. But the impact of the pandemic is not gone. So that's why you're seeing even more so now businesses close, because that lifeline is gone. Those resources that were available at all levels of government are largely gone. So we did, through the CARES Act and then the American Rescue Plan Act, we did about $4 million of resiliency grants to small businesses, to about, I think it was about 400 small businesses in the city, to help them just keep the lights on, keep people on payroll throughout the last few years. And so that, I think, was a big help, a big lifeline to get some folks through those very difficult times. But again, those impacts of the pandemic are not gone, so they're still dealing. So shop local is one theme, definitely shop local. So we have that business development team in our office. We have our neighborhood development, and I would consider it neighborhood and community development. So these folks in our neighborhood development division are really the main folks that are administering the federal resources that we get. So one of the programs is called Community Development Block Grant. We get annual dollars through that process based on our population size and our income demographics. It's what's called an entitlement grant. So we just get these dollars from the federal government based on a funding formula. We don't have to apply for it. We don't have to make our case to the federal government. We just get them. It's called an entitlement grant because of our population size and our income demographics. And we can use those dollars for a variety of things. We can use it for infrastructure. Infrastructure was mentioned before. We're doing some infrastructure improvements with these dollars down in Green Island. Coming up this spring, we'll get going on the Endicott Street project and the Bigelow Street project right by Crompton Park. And in years past, Crompton Park has benefited from CDBG investments. We can also do public services. So some of our community-based partners, nonprofits in the community that are doing, food pantries or after-school programs, case management, a variety of different services for low and moderate income families. They apply to us every year to try to access these federal dollars. It's a pretty competitive, like anything, there's not enough resources to go around. So what we do is we hold an annual application process. There are certainly lots of different federal strings attached to it, like things that you can do versus things you can't do with the dollars, a lot of reporting requirements. And so through that application process, we review those proposals with a community of residents. So one of our boards and commissions is our Community Development Advisory Committee that reviews those with us in relationship to the pressing needs that are facing the community to come up with those awards for those grant dollars. It's something that is certainly at risk right now, right, with what's going on federally, if those kinds of programs will be cut or whether we'll continue to receive those. And some of those services that are supported through that are vitally important for the nonprofit community that does, in a lot of ways, what government is just not good at doing, what government maybe should be doing sometimes, but it just isn't good at doing sometimes. So we rely really strongly on some of our nonprofit partners to fill those gaps and meet those needs that they're seeing at the grassroots level. In addition, I had mentioned that with some of the federal funds we get, there's a number of expectations. Sometimes it can be confusing when people think about nonprofits. Nonprofits certainly rely on grant dollars that are made available to their organization, because in a lot of cases nonprofits are providing free services to the folks that they're serving. One of the things that is a distinction for sure is like the distinction between philanthropy and government grants, right? So philanthropy, those donors, when you deal with like somebody like the Greater Worcester Community Foundation or family foundations, and some people might remember when, I'm forgetting her first name, but Jeff Bezos' wife donated a substantial amount to United Ways across the country, the United Way. Those are philanthropic kind of channels that they have a lot more latitude to just do kind of what they feel like is the right thing to do, set those kinds of funding structures up in the way that they feel like are the most appropriate. When you're dealing with taxpayer dollars and government grants, there's a long stack of paperwork that comes with those to make sure that the taxpayers' interests are protected and that those dollars are being used for what they're intended to do, that the outcomes are what folks are hoping to see are outcomes with their taxpayer dollars, and to make sure that there's no like fraud or abuse that's happening with taxpayer dollars. So the world of government grants is very different than philanthropy, but both of those sources are critical to support the nonprofit sector. So we work, again, like what we do is we kind of try to be facilitators across all the different kind of stakeholders or folks in the ecosystem of economic development, whether it's the private sector, the public sector, small businesses, local, helping residents directly. We kind of do a little bit of all of it. We also have a cultural development division. So they lead a couple of things. They help facilitate. We have a Worcester Arts Council. So one of our boards and commissions is the Worcester Arts Council. And they receive funding from the state, the Mass Cultural Council, to do smaller kind of grants, usually in like the $5,000 range, to support community-based organizations as well as artists doing different cultural offerings for the city, for the community, I should say, not the city government, but for the community. And so sometimes those are organizations, sometimes those are artists, various expressions, like art galleries, shows, poetry, all those kinds of things. So that is supported by the Worcester Arts Council. We just had a press release today, I think it was, about the latest round of grants out of the Worcester Arts Council process. And so again, that's a board of Worcester residents that are making decisions, reviewing those proposals, making decisions on how those dollars get spent. And again, like anything, there's not enough resources to go around. I think we had over 100 applications, and we were able to fund about half of them, maybe even a little less than half. The Cultural Development Office is also really working closely on trying to make our special event permitting process more streamlined, more accessible for folks that are having these offerings available to our community. So when you think about festivals like the Latin American Festival, the Caribbean American Carnival, the Start on the Street Festival, the Pride Festival, that takes a lot of work. It's often very volunteer-led. They have limited resources. They're kind of usually either trying to get sponsorships or raise funds to put those on. But the economic impact of those is substantial. I mean, when you think of Start on the Street, 30,000 people coming, supporting those vendors, then often going out to eat in those restaurants in that district. Like, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars of economic impact. And so how do we facilitate that activity? That's a good thing. We want to kind of facilitate that and how it supports all of the folks that, are vendors or the small businesses that experience that activity before and after events. So trying to make that process easier. You'll be seeing some information about those efforts coming soon. And then the Cultural Development Office also facilitates the work of the Worcester Cultural Coalition. The Worcester Cultural Coalition is a nonprofit coalition of community-based organizations in the arts and culture sector. So they try to coordinate things and speak with one voice as it relates to sometimes advocacy at the state level, advocacy at the federal level. The Cultural Coalition as an entity is the group that actually has been operating the Gene McDonough Art Center and the Brick Box Theater across the street at 20 Franklin Street to try to have an accessible location for organizations to use that space. At a fraction of the cost of trying to rent the Hanover Theater, for example, or trying to rent Mechanics Hall. So trying to have those kinds of accessible spaces for our cultural offerings in the city. The other division we have is special projects. So these are utility players, other duties as assigned. A lot of it tends to be real estate related or some of the bigger initiatives that you hear about. Our team in special projects, along with the Worcester Redevelopment Authority, did some of the day-to-day oversight of the Polar Park project. So obviously there's a lot involved in Polar Park with the City Council, the City of Worcester, the State of Massachusetts, the baseball team. But at the end of the day, somebody had to oversee the contract with the builder, oversee the contract with the designer, oversee the lease with the team, and that was led by our Special Projects Division, of course, with a lot of support from the Law Department, Administration and Finance, DPW. So again, we kind of probably do the most amount of collaboration compared with other departments. And then I'll speak to this a little bit later, but the Worcester Redevelopment Authority owns and operates Union Station, so we oversee Union Station. They also do, Tim mentioned the tax increment financing. So when we start to do, different kinds of special projects related to attracting investment and trying to make sure that those projects are successful with tax increment financing or tax increment exemptions, our special projects team leads that effort. Our special projects team is also, and I'll speak to this a little bit more, is leading the implementation and the work of the Community Preservation Act, the Community Preservation Committee, which is pretty exciting in its first year. And then the last division that we have is a little bit of a hybrid. It's so we do have a workforce development division. There's an organizational chart that kind of reports up through me in that sense. But there's also a lot of state employees there. So the workforce development division is part of the whole Mass Hire network. So the Mass Hire Central Region, they have a career center, and then they have a workforce investment board. So the career center helps job seekers as well as employers that are hiring. And then the workforce investment board side of that organization does some of the skills kind of training. So like making sure that folks in our community are able to access the skills necessary to be able to pursue careers that are growing. So we have a number of different programs, whether it's building pathways with the construction trades, whether it's we have a biomanufacturing certificate program to get into the life sciences industry and those great careers that are happening. And so those are the two kind of sides of the house at Mass Hire. Some of them are, I think it's probably about 40% or so are city employees. The other 60% are state employees. The good thing is that almost all of those, even the city employees, are funded through state and federal grants, which is good. But it's good to also have them kind of attached at the hip to the city, because then we're all kind of working off of the same music and kind of coordinating priorities and kind of what's necessary to make sure that folks are able to access good paying jobs in the city. So that's kind of like the framework of the different divisions that make up what we do. I will kind of give a little bit more on the boards and commissions that are, so this is a great opportunity of like, how do you get involved, or how does it relate to civic engagement? And I'm forgetting to, I mentioned them, but I actually forgot two of them on here as I was rushing to put this together today. The two that are missing, I mentioned the Community Development Advisory Committee that oversees the CDBG grant making process, and then the Worcester Arts Council are two in addition to this list. But the first four are really facilitated by our Planning and Regulatory Services Division. So these are the boards and commissions related to land use in the city. So the Planning Board, the Zoning Board of Appeals, the Conservation Commission, and the Historical Commission. The Planning Board is the body that really has jurisdiction, along with the City Council, over the zoning ordinance of the city. So what can be done where in the city? There's residential zoning districts, and there's residential zoning districts of different densities. We have single-family zoning districts. We have multifamily zoning districts. We have mixed-use districts where you could do residential as well as some commercial. We have manufacturing districts in the city. We also have overlay districts and different things related to that. So what can you do with a piece of property? It has to do with the zoning district of where that property is located. So the entire city is broken up into these zoning districts. Some of the lines don't make sense. We're working on that. But that's been something that is, I would say, kind of like a Band-Aid approach. Our zoning ordinance is not broken. You know, our zoning ordinance is functional. It's not terrible. But it's a function of like Band-Aids that have been put on it over the course of several years. So some of the things that have been done, you know, maybe over the last 20 years have been solid in terms of making amendments to it and making some changes. But the base and like the bones of our zoning ordinance is still 50 plus years old. So one of the things that we're doing now, and I'll speak to a little bit further, is really considering an entire zoning overhaul. So keeping a lot of the things that are good, that work, but really addressing the bones, because it's only so long that you can do the Band-Aid approach until you have to like take a real comprehensive look at it. And so that is stemming from, hopefully you've heard of the Worcester Now Next plan. So that is the plan that is kind of kicked off that effort. That plan itself is the framework. It's not the zoning rewrite, it's the framework, but one of the recommendations out of that was to undertake a comprehensive zoning rewrite. So we will be tasked with doing that. We will need to enlist the help of outside consultants with that. It's a massive undertaking. We cannot do that with in-house staff. It just would be far too much to try to accomplish in any kind of short-term period. The planning board also, or the zoning ordinance also has dimensional requirements. So like when you think of if I have a piece of land and I can build something on it, I know that I'm allowed to build it on it. So like so let's just use a single family house as an example. I have a piece of land that has no structure on it. I want to put a single family house on it. Well, there's some dimensional requirements in the zoning ordinance as well about it needs to be set back from the property line so much. It can only be a certain height. You need to have a certain amount of off-street parking. So there are dimensional kind of controls in the zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance also does a variety of other things too, like the signage regulations and things like that I won't bore you with. The Zoning Board of Appeals has a role, particularly like if you want to do something with a piece of property, it's not just a yes or no. So if I have like a piece of property that's zoned in a certain district, and what I want to do is not allowed, what we call by right. So there's three options really in the zoning ordinance. That use could either be allowed by right, which means you don't need any special permission. It could be not allowed, which means don't ask, it's not allowed, or it could be allowed with a special permit. And so that is special consideration, it's a discretionary approval. it's kind of like a maybe answer. And that maybe is answered at the Zoning Board of Appeals. That's the easiest way to describe it. So if you do want to do something and it could be allowed with that special permit, you would seek that from the Zoning Board of Appeals. And then the Zoning Board of Appeals also grants what's called variances. So if you are not able to maybe comply with some of those dimensional requirements, a setback, off-street parking, these days, you see a lot of people going into the Zoning Board of Appeals for a variance on the required off-street parking. And so that's another function that they have. The Conservation Commission, we obviously need to try to protect wetlands, so they oversee the Wetlands Protection Act, as well as just general construction control. So like if somebody's doing a significant amount of construction near catch basins, and then that goes down into the Blackstone River watershed and down to the Upper Blackstone Water Treatment Plant, and then down to Sutton and the Blackstone Valley region, we're held to a certain standard by regulators like Mass DEP and EPA that the water leaving the city is of a certain quality. And so the best way to help us do that at a reasonable cost, I guess you could say, at the filtration plant is preventing things from getting into it in the first place. And so if people are doing a significant amount of construction near catch basins in the ground, we want to make sure that they have those erosion controls, silt fences, things like that, that are protecting that silt and that soil and all that from getting into our system that then we'll have to filter out and treat down at the Upper Blackstone Water Filtration Plant. The Conservation Commission also holds close to 1,000 acres of property. So they hold conservation restrictions, and sometimes they hold the ownership of property, conservation land in the city. We also work really closely with the Greater Worcester Land Trust. So some of the conservation land in the city is not all Conservation Commission owned. Some other conservation land beyond that 1,000 or so acres, it's a little less than 1,000 that we have, could be owned by the Greater Worcester Land Trust as well. So that's a really important community partner that we have. And then the Historical Commission. So if you're going to be doing renovations to a historical property, if it's listed on the state list, they particularly look at the exterior. So if you're going to be changing original windows, if you're going to be changing original roof, like slate roofs, masonry elements, things like that, you might need to seek their approval, and certainly on demolition as well. There is not really a total protection over the demolition of properties. There's what's called the demolition delay ordinance. So if it's listed on the state historic list or national historic list, they could come into the Historical Commission and ask for a delay waiver, meaning I'd like to take it down next week or next month. And if the commission says no, that would be detrimental to the city, you have to wait a year. Then they have to wait that year, and then that allows the city, as well as groups like Preservation Worcester, to try to work with that owner to find alternative plans or strategies rather than seeing that property come down. But when that year is up, they have another year from that date to take it down. There's no ultimate protection on that. There is some additional protections that, especially around design, in the local historic districts. So you could have just properties that are listed on the state historic list, or you could have actual designated local historic districts, which is a higher kind of standard that says an impact to this property or any property is going to have a detrimental impact on this entire district. So we have 4 in the city. We have the Montvale district off of Salisbury Street. We have the Mass Ave district off of Salisbury Street. We have the Crown Hill district closer to downtown here off of Pleasant Street. And then our office, just over the last 3 years, with the Historic Commission and the City Council, established the 4th and largest local historic district in the city, which is the Elm Park Local Historic District. That was just recently established in 2023. After it takes a long time to go through it, that process started when Becker College announced that they were closing. So there was a lot of concern from that community and those properties, as well as the surrounding properties, even the ones that were not owned by Becker, of like, what's going to happen here? Is somebody going to come in, clear cut all these properties? What's going to be the kind of negative consequences on the community? And so one of the things that came out of those discussions with that neighborhood, with the City Council, with the Historical Commission, was to undertake that study to petition to the state to create that 4th and largest local historic district in the city. The Community Preservation Committee is our newest board that we're working with now. So under that law that Tim described, the Community Preservation Act, the law requires communities to create a Community Preservation Committee to decide on what will be the priorities for those funds, and then how will those funds be distributed through an application process. So as Tim mentioned, the Community Preservation Act funds that are generated can go to 3 areas: affordable housing, open space and recreation, and historic preservation. Those 3 does not have to be a 33% split, doesn't have to be a third. Each one of those categories has to be at least 10%, but it doesn't require, like I said, an even split. So based on, and this has been going on over the last few months, based on looking at a lot of the other planning efforts that have already happened, but also additional community engagement around that, trying to figure out what are the greatest needs in these areas. What are the greatest needs in affordable housing that we're seeing? What are the greatest needs around open space and recreation? What are the greatest needs around historic preservation? And then structuring an application form that's going to be available very shortly. So what they've done over the last few months, we have a full-time staff member that's paid out of those funds as well. You can use it for administrative, 5%, up to 5% for administrative expenses. So we have a full-time staff member carrying out that work, and they've published the draft plan. It's available on our website. Hopefully you've seen about it. We've been kind of doing some social media and updates about that. That kind of goes through goals and priorities, building off of other planning efforts, but building off of what the engagement process has looked like over the last 4 months. And there's not going to be a prescribed set, like we're going to do 50% housing or we're going to do 25% open space, but it gives you a sense of like what are those kind of greatest needs or priorities and goals. And then depending on when this application is put forth, what we get back will be influenced, and those decisions and the funding distribution will be largely influenced by what the plan calls for. So that's exciting. I think it's one of the more exciting committees to be a part of, because like what other committee gets to decide what's going to be funded in the community for a lot of, I think, will be pretty impactful projects. So looking forward to that process. And then the Worcester Redevelopment Authority, as I mentioned, oversees, if you're not familiar with redevelopment authorities, it's actually kind of its own legal entity. It's not just a board and commission, it's its own politic body that is independent of the city council. But I would say that it's very much reliant on the city council because they don't have any money. So anything that they need to do, they need to come into the city council and ask for the money to do it. So it's not like it's going to go out and do all these crazy things that the city council has no control over. And I will say that even before maybe in the 90s when Med City was happening. So redevelopment authorities have urban renewal powers, essentially, right? Under state law, urban renewal power is the power to do eminent domain for redevelopment purposes. Municipality can do eminent domain, take people's property. You have to compensate them for it, but municipality can take people's property by eminent domain for municipal purposes, if we need to build a school, or if we need to build a fire station, things like that, or if we need to widen a roadway, even if it's just not the whole property, maybe we're taking 10 feet of somebody's property because we need to widen a roadway. Those are eminent domain activities for municipal purposes, but under state law, redevelopment authorities have eminent domain powers for redevelopment purposes. It can be a very controversial topic. There were a lot of bad decisions, bad urban renewal strategies in the 1970s, case in point being the Galleria Mall and the complete destruction of 40 acres downtown. Those were the bad days of urban renewal, and it's been a long time to try to get out of that. But it still exists, and it can be useful, but I think the modern days of urban renewal are far more tactical. So really targeting specific areas of disinvestment or specific properties rather than doing large clearances of land for things like the Galleria. So in the 90s when they were doing Med City, the redevelopment authority was even more independent than it is today because they had like their own executive director, their own staff and all of that. Still kind of relied on the city council for, some of the finances and what they were doing, but I think the leash was a little too long. Maybe is my personal, editorial on that. And so now it's very much in line with us. So I serve as the Chief Development Officer for the City of Worcester, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the Redevelopment Authority. So I have the privilege of doing 2 jobs for 1 salary. And so we'll talk a little bit more about them, but they have their own board. One of the board members is appointed by the governor of Massachusetts because it's kind of enacted or enabled through state law. But again, there's a lot of coordination between what they're doing, what the city's doing, the city manager, the city council. So all of that is aligned. So some of the planning efforts that we've done or that are active right now that are notable, we've been doing a lot of this. A lot of where we want to go as a community relies on community engagement first and foremost. So when we do these things, we try to figure out what's our strategy, whether it's a particular area of the city or whether it's a particular topic matter. We want to have the planning efforts first to shape that direction of where we're going and make sure that that planning effort has the community engagement so that we're not making decisions up in the 4 corners of our offices, that we're kind of fulfilling those visions or crafting those visions based on community engagement. So Worcester Now Next, as I mentioned, that really is the growth framework. So it's very focused on the built environment, which is one of the kind of themes or terminologies I've been using because we have like the strategic plan of the city and a lot of different other plans. So like What's the Now Next plan? How does that fit in? It's really focused on accommodating growth, thinking about growth in a strategic way, but the built environment as well. So again, a lot of the recommendations out of it was about zoning. One of an offshoot of that was the mobility action plan. So our transportation and mobility department has been doing the mobility action plan, and that's because land use and transportation are inextricably linked. And so trying to make sure that, again, when we're thinking about where is the housing located in the city, where are the jobs located in the city, how do I get from where I live to where I want to work, those kinds of things, they're inevitably linked. And so the headline, I guess I would say, this plan Now Next has a 2040 outlook. It falls under what's called a comprehensive plan. We hadn't done a comprehensive plan like this related to zoning since 1987, so it was long overdue. And the headline of it is, as we think about 2040 and the population trends that we've seen and all of the population indication of where we're going through 2040, is that we'll have to accommodate upwards of 60,000 new residents by 2040 compared to 2020. So we're already 5 years in. But from 2020 to 2040 could be a 60,000 new residents comprising about 20,000 new housing units is what so where do you put that? And so this is about, where do we put that? And where do we put the jobs and the commercial development? It's not just housing, but also commercial development and all of that. And so then similarly, we just announced and shared with the City Council last night a draft housing production plan. The housing production plan really focuses on the housing aspect of that. This has a little bit shorter term outlook. It was like over the next 8 years, about, 12,000 over the next 8 years. So again, similar order of magnitude wise, similar kind of, and this is good, it's almost validation because there are different teams working on this, different sets of consultants and, statistical groups that are like looking at that. So it's good validation to see that a lot are coming to the same conclusion around order of magnitude. And the housing production plan really dives a little bit deeper into like the demographics and the types of housing. Do we need more senior housing? What are those kinds of trends happening and needs around that? So it gets much more verbose on the nuances of housing production. And the role that our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, actually that's funny, like as I was mentioning, we have an Affordable Housing Trust Fund as well. That's a pretty new body that is, it was originally starting to do housing production, like basically dollars available, financial assistance to facilitate housing production projects. And it was initially capitalized with American Rescue Plan Act dollars, about $17 million of American Rescue Plan Act dollars. And moving forward, now that those dollars are gone, they're at least committed to projects. Some of them are under construction right now. Moving forward, it'll be funded, the Housing Trust Fund will be funded by CPA dollars, Community Preservation Act dollars, as well as payment in lieu, not from the colleges, but I'll describe a different concept related to payment in lieu in a minute. And then we have the cultural plan, the urban revitalization plan. So the redevelopment authority is charged when it kind of sets out what it's looking to accomplish under the powers that it has or the role that it has. It creates an urban revitalization plan. So the Worcester Redevelopment Authority has 2 active urban revitalization plans right now. One is around Union Station and Washington Square, and then the other one is the downtown urban revitalization plan, which includes the area around the theater district, including the Denholm building project, and that district, that plan area goes across the railroad tracks to the ballpark area where Wyman Gordon was. And then while we're not like kind of the stewards of the open space and recreation plan, this is really the Parks Division under DPW, but we have a lot of roles relative to that because of the Conservation Commission, Conservation Land, Open Space. So those are some of the more recent planning kind of efforts and topical areas that have been guiding some of our work. And then just to kind of get a little bit more detailed on our housing strategy. So a couple of years ago, we, in 2023, we went into the City Council to try to organize our framework and what we're trying to accomplish around housing. So this was before the Housing Production Plan was created. Now Next was kind of happening. And housing can be a really complex topic. I see a lot on social media, like what even is affordable housing? So we can talk about that if you want. But largely affordable housing is with a capital A. So I think people get confused when you think about affordable housing with what I would say is a capital A versus a lowercase a. So capital A affordable housing is deed restricted. It has been subsidized by the government, local, state, or federal, and it has a deed restriction requiring that rent in that unit does not exceed a certain amount. And that amount is set by the federal government based on our area. And that also comes with income qualifications for who's living there. And so that affordable housing that's deed restricted needs to, and it depends on, there's different levels of affordable housing, but the household, the folks that are living in that unit need to qualify also based on their income level, because that's who the housing is built for. And so that's kind of like the capital A. And it's a little bit different than public housing. Public housing is a different animal. Worcester Housing Authority, that's a different animal. But affordable housing, what I would say with a lowercase a, is what we know is like just in the community, in the three-deckers, kind of in the organic kind of rental market, can I afford this or can I not? And I think that's where we're seeing the biggest pressures as a community, because we've had a lot of what we would call naturally occurring affordable housing. That'd be like affordable housing with a lowercase a. Doesn't have a deed restriction, doesn't have income qualifications to live there, doesn't have maximum rents, but it was just generally affordable for people to pay that rent every month. That's where we're seeing the greatest pressures, because we have people, in my opinion, that are kind of overpaying for properties and then having to charge more on rent because now they have to pay a mortgage that's much more significant than the last person that had a mortgage on that property. And so I think we're seeing that biggest kind of vulnerability or risk is with the naturally occurring affordable housing in the city. So that's my 30-second description of that. So what we have here that we tried to guide our housing strategy, and this is what's come from the, we have a new strategic plan, but from the strategic plan that was done under City Manager Augustus, there were some themes, values, which was opportunities for all, strong neighborhoods, and equity. And so these were kind of the themes that were guiding our housing strategy, built on three primary pillars: housing production, preservation, healthy homes. I've already talked a little bit about that. You know, the existing housing stock, preserving it, investing in it to make sure that it's healthy and meeting the needs of our population. Housing production, a lot of what we're also seeing is a supply issue, supply shortage. We have not kept up with the housing production needs of our community, so we need to build more of all kinds. So that's kind of one that you could kind of consider as like, this is the built housing stock kind of pillar. The other pillar on the other side that I'll touch on next is public policy stuff, and we've been doing a lot around that. One is inclusionary zoning. So inclusionary zoning was something that was put forward in 2022 and then adopted in 2023 by the City Council. It involves multiple layers. There was community engagement as part of that. Went to the planning board. Our office was involved in looking at a lot of best practices and research, because inclusionary zoning does not look the same in every community. You have to kind of decide what works for your community and what those details are. And then it goes to the planning board and then back to the City Council. And so we do have inclusionary zoning now as a city, which basically means if somebody is creating a project of 12 or more units of housing, so a larger kind of scale housing development project, a certain amount of that should be set aside for affordable housing, capital A, deed restricted affordable housing. We have a sliding scale model, depending on the level of affordability. So it's either 10% of the project if it's at the 60% of area median income household level, or 15% of the project if it's at the 80% area median income, or some combination thereof. And then one other option for compliance, because there are certainly a good amount of sources of capital and developers that just do not do affordable housing. It's just a different asset class. It's just not what they do. So we have one option that is a payment in lieu. And if you choose that payment in lieu, it goes to our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So we also have, now next would fall into the public policy, accessory dwelling units. I'm going to rush here because I want to get to questions in our conversation. And so those things, and then in the middle here would be some of the specialty programs that I mentioned of like, how do we help homeowners, how do we help tenants, and how do we help the unhoused population? So, you know, down payment assistance, rental assistance, you know, our transitional housing, that would kind of fall in that area. So those are our kind of three pillars, and then they're built on these foundations of doing a housing production plan. So we've now have that completed or drafted at least. Always dependent on community-based partnerships. We cannot do that alone. We can't solve the housing challenges that we face as a municipality alone. It relies on community-based partnerships, and then certainly local, state, and federal resources. I will, in the interest of time, well, I guess one thing I'll just say, because I've talked a lot about housing, I did this because I wanted to mention, at least on commercial, we do a lot to try to also create jobs, commercial investment, new businesses or expanding businesses. And one of our major initiatives right now is the Greendale Revitalization Area. If you've driven by on 190, you will see the transformation happening at the former Norton Company in St. Gobain. So this started as a retention project. If you can imagine this whole area, this is just the area that we're working on right now with some of our partners in red. There's more to the campus. But they had 93 structures on the property that were all part of an above-ground combined heat and power system. but they were only using 40 structures. So that's a lot of structures to be heating and powering if you're not using them. And so it started as a retention project to get St. Gobain right-sized into a quadrant of the campus. They just, and save those jobs. There's like probably a little over 1,000 jobs that they have. They built a new combined heat and power system, 22 million, and they're currently building a new 47,000 square foot office building, administrative building. So it was a job retention project first and foremost. And then our partners at the Worcester Business Development Corporation, I've been working with them. They took title to 51 acres. And so this is, I like this project too because it combines a lot of the themes of what I was talking about, where you have the industrial legacy of what's left behind. 51 acres, these buildings are no longer conducive to modern days of manufacturing. So it's not like some other company's gonna walk in and lease that property, not gonna happen. So we need to prepare it for the 21st century of manufacturing and jobs. And so that comes with demolition, remediation. The cost of doing that and the infrastructure upgrades is about $50 million. The private sector, like if St. Gobain put a for sale sign on that, nobody's touching it. Nobody's touching that for $50 million to just get you to square one of having a clean piece of land to work with. So the WBDC is a great partner of ours. They're a nonprofit economic development corporation. They specialize in brownfields redevelopment. So they come in and prepare these opportunities to pave the way for private investment and job creation. That's their mission, is to create jobs and expand the tax base. So they come in, assemble dollars from mostly state and federal. So there's like an EPA brownfields grant in here. There's MassWorks grants from the state of Massachusetts to deal with that. I will say that St. Gobain contributed $12 million. You know, they kind of own their kind of responsibility to some degree there and invested $12 million for that. And so a lot of this has been ahead of schedule, so they're getting it ready, where this will be basically a new industrial park for 21st century companies and jobs. And that effort to reclaim that brownfield, deal with it, to ultimately see new productive uses. Because if this just lied fallow for the next 25 years, like Wyman Gordon did in the Canal District, that's not helping anybody. It's not producing its potential as it relates to our tax base. It's not producing its potential in terms of jobs that would be made available for our community, and all the rest of it. So I like it. It's also smart growth in terms of like, rather than having some company that might be interested in Central Mass go clear, 20 acres of trees in Sutton and build a property in Sutton on 20 acres of trees, why can't we reuse the existing developed infrastructure in the area that we have? That's just smart growth. So I wanted to touch on that. And then Union Station, I won't touch on a whole lot of. Worcester Redevelopment Authority oversees it. A big thing is that I think it's been a game changer when you think back to their original restoration of it in the 90s and how that's fueled the growth of the city. Continued, I think the opportunities are huge in terms of how that could play a similar role moving forward into the next decade or two. And we just completed, in partnership with MBTA, a $45 million investment on what we call the center platform. So it's going to double the potential capacity of train service at Union Station. We basically have a whole nother platform and track to have multiple trains there at the same time. And then if they're successful with East-West Rail connecting Boston to Springfield, that will come through Worcester, so we'll be able to accommodate that. So it lays the groundwork for hopefully what will be transformative public transportation from Springfield to Boston. That's a huge investment, but at least we're doing what we can now to prepare for that opportunity in the future. So that was a little longer than I wanted, but I do also want to hear from you all about any questions you have. Yes.
Hi, I have a question about like lowercase a affordability and rent. So I know a lot of renters in the city, they have mortgages they're trying to pay, but there's also a lot of renters that are these large investment companies. I live in one of those complexes, and I know a lot of the new construction comes from these big investment complexes. So is there anything the city is able to do to keep those new projects affordable? Lowercase a, I know you said a portion of it goes to lower to median income. Yep. And in addition, is there any more relief for like small businesses? I can think of recently both Redemption Rock and BT's both cited rent increases as why they closed. So I was wondering if the city is doing anything for, those businesses.
Sure. As it relates to when you see the newer product coming online, I think that the answer there is the inclusionary zoning, so trying to make sure that they're setting aside a certain amount for affordable. That would be the capital A because they'll be deed restricted. You won't see the naturally occurring affordable housing on new construction, and it's purely fundamental on the economics of it. So one of the problems we have, and I'll try to use a real example of a project. So there's the project that has been proposed at just near Union Station behind the Grafton Street Fire Station, where the cold storage fire was, those properties there, that has been proposed to take down those kind of disinvested properties there and do new construction. 364 units, a significant project, transit-oriented development right there. They will have a portion affordable, but where I'm going with that is that the cost to build that project is about $130 million. And our assessor's opinion of value, because we did a tax negotiation on that, our assessor's opinion of value based on the income approach. So the market rate rents that they would get, you know, that's how the assessor looks at a property, what's the income producing potential of the property. Our assessor's opinion that once they're done investing $130 million, it'll be worth about 75. That's a really hard thing to finance if you're spending $130 million on an asset that's going to be worth $75 million. That is the fundamental problem that we have in the city. So you won't see naturally occurring affordable housing in those because they're upside down. They're upside down. Why is that? It's construction costs. Construction costs are out of control. Construction cost. And that's why you don't see condos either. Everybody says, why is there this proliferation of rentals happening in the city? It's because at least if they hold that for 10 years and recoup their investment through the 10 years of the rents, that starts to make a little sense in that whole formula. But we're not seeing condos creating in the city, much of them here or there, but not much, because on average, you're seeing the cost to develop a unit of housing, you know, in the $400,000 range. Well, when the median sales price on a condo is like $375, like how am I gonna build condos to sell it at a loss? Unless you're building nice, like, so the people that are doing it, maybe they're selling those condos at like 550 or 600, and then now it starts to make a little bit of sense. But that's the real challenge, and that's why, you know, people, it can be controversial sometimes, but when we do these tax increment exemptions or tax increment financing, that's the problem that we're solving for, is the financing gap, because while it seems like, oh, people must be making money hand over fist because, you know, the demand is so strong, rents are going up, it has not kept pace with construction costs and the cost of capital now. You know, when you think about the cost of borrowing, where interest rates are at, you know, that person that's going to make, you know, spend $130 million building that project, well, they're paying back that money at 7% now. You know, so it all just makes the numbers really challenging to make sense. So that's why we need to continue to work together, public sector, private sector, because at the end of the day, we need to produce the housing. We haven't kept up with the housing production we need to see, so we have to work together to get that stuff built. Yes. Oh, I didn't answer your business question. You know, we can't unfortunately just subsidize annual operating losses that businesses face. You know, we are trying to do some things around commercial rents as well. So one innovative project that we've been working with, it's under construction right now, the Maine South Community Development Corporation, is they were able to take possession of a vacant lot right on Main Street in Maine South and worked with us as well as Mass Development to create some subsidy that's necessary to build affordable commercial condos. So we think about like home ownership is a pathway to wealth. Well, how can we not, let's take that same concept and apply it to businesses where we can build commercial condos where they can now own their unit and not have that vulnerability or that risk about being a tenant with a landlord that could keep raising rents and whatnot. So we're trying to think about those strategies, but I would say that with small businesses right now too, there's just such a confluence of factors. You know, there's workforce challenges, there's costs of goods, certainly. You know, when you think about BT's barbecue, they're selling meats and things like that. Like, what are the margins on that? Because they're trying to not put all that onto the price that they're charging their customer. They're trying to keep it accessible that people will be able to afford getting lunch there, getting dinner there. But just those margins become slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. And then you see, as everybody has experienced, the National Grid bills and the Eversource bills, you layer all that on top, their insurance bills. Like, it's the margins on what businesses need to survive, it's getting pinched for sure. So that's a hard thing for us to solve for as a municipality.
Hi, I'm also the Worcester Pickleball Facebook administrator, and I filed a petition last fall for the installation of pickleball courts. We're really lagging behind everybody else. So you mentioned an entitlement grant, and I'll be trying to apply for the Community Preservation Fund Act. I believe we have like $300,000 that could be applied towards the, what is it called? The open space. That's what I was told the last time I was on the meeting with them. So can that also be used for the entitlement grant? Can we use that to help with the installment of pickleball courts?
So there's a few layers to that, and then we can connect offline to kind of get into some of the nuances of it. But different sources of funding have different eligibility criteria. And so it's matching up what you're looking to do with the right program based on the eligibility considerations of that program. We haven't actually launched applications yet for Community Preservation Act, so you wouldn't have applied to that particular program. It's coming up. Yes, it's coming up. And there could be a role for I don't know the whole strategy, but around like the Parks Department and Jacqueline, yeah, is on our staff. And then Community Development Block Grant is really designed for benefiting low to moderate income residents. So we'd have to think through who's the applicant, are they an eligible applicant, where is it being located, is it going to be accessible to the, so we can talk about that, but it gets into a little bit nuanced about like all of the different federal grant requirements about what the program's designed to do, what it's looking to accomplish, and who's like eligible, and what activities are eligible to fund. So the term entitlement is what I was referring to in terms of some of the federal funds that just come to us because of our population size and income demographics. So the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, is an example of an entitlement grant. Yeah. So I, just off the top of my head, not knowing more about the structure of your organization and whatnot, where you're thinking about doing this, I just can't say for certain that it would be eligible for that grant, but we can connect after this and we can talk more about that, yeah.
Hello. Hi, Peter. I just have a quick question on some subjects that we've touched on as far as the food deserts go. I had a meeting earlier today, and parents in different communities spoke of the supermarkets. We know that it's a national issue that's happening, the cost of food, et cetera. What is the city doing as far as taking initiatives? Because I do know that you are reaching out to other grocery chains. If so, how are negotiations going? What does that look like? And what information are you giving out to the community to either better prepare us or to set up, especially like the elderly community that isn't really efficient with like Instacart or apps and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say we have like a partial role in that, particularly on the facilitation kind of side of it, I guess you could say, is as it relates to the larger grocers, we do know that there are some larger grocer brands that are interested in the Worcester market generally, like the Worcester like the Worcester community. As it relates to like recruiting them, we don't really have an active role or real influence in that because what happens is they need a significant amount of square footage, and you would think that the logical thing would be to go to backfill, one of the ones that have closed. I do know that the owner of the Stop and Shop at Lincoln Plaza is specifically being patient to try to lease that back out to a grocer. And when we asked them if we could be helpful in that recruitment strategy and talking with grocers, they said that that was, a cute suggestion, but like that they have these strong relationships because they're a national group that have these, facilities, these retail plazas all over. They're like, we have a direct line to like the CEO of that grocer. So like, yeah, we'll let you know, but like, it's not like what you're going to do is going to enhance our relationship or ability to recruit that grocer. So, recognizing like kind of what we are as a municipality versus something that's like more regional or almost like national in scope. But one of the things that we're working on right now with some community partners, and this is still very in its infancy, but with Regional Environmental Council, the Coalition for a Healthy Greater Worcester, is we have reached out to Daily Table. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. They're in the Boston area. They're kind of a community-driven grocery option that accepts various forms of, SNAP and WIC and things like that. A great basically a great, interesting model on delivering food to different community level neighborhoods. They're not in a position to expand to our market, but we're trying to think through as a group of different stakeholders, how can we try to like replicate that model? So trying to think differently too, and not just rely on like the big guys, right? Like the big grocers trying to think about different models that we can try to help facilitate that are maybe more community driven as well, like co-op models and things like that. So yeah, we definitely play a role in trying to facilitate some of that, but unfortunately, it's like not something that we could kind of like snap our fingers and say yes. But you're right. When there is something more substantive in terms, specifically on that community partnership, we'll definitely have some communication that kind of goes out more broadly, ways for people to maybe support or get involved and make sure that people are aware. But it's just such at its infancy right now that there probably hasn't been much communicated yet about that. Yeah.
All right, Peter, I'm just going to do 2 more questions with your permission. I've got Marissa in the back and then Ibrahim. And then I'm going to wrap things up and we can talk about questions that have not been answered. Okay?
Hi, my question actually kind of relates to what you just asked as well, but more generally around community engagement. So I was happy to hear like the city is trying to do, sounds like more community engagement, but I was wondering if the city has like a community engagement specialist or strategy that kind of goes beyond like social media or like flyers or emails to kind of engage with different demographics and residents kind of where they're at. And keep momentum in between projects as well.
Yeah, you know, it's something that is a constant thing that I think needs to be always reevaluated because people consume information in such different ways all the time, and that changes like rapidly daily. Like I think like right, nobody's really using X anymore; they're using other platforms and stuff. So it's always changing, and like even just having, as we know from like all of the digital equity work, like people that just don't even have Wi-Fi, don't even have devices and things like that. So it's multifaceted and also in multiple languages too. That's really important. So we do a variety of things. In terms of also relying on some of our institutional partners that are in those locations and trying to get out into the community. We don't just do it from behind our desks and whatnot. We go out, often using like the senior center or using community-based organizations to do that neighborhood-based outreach. But yeah, there's always ways to do more. We have a centralized communications team in the city manager's office, so all of our departments work through that centralized communications team is like kind of the direct answer to how it's like structured, I guess you could say. And that has been bolstered. I'd say one of the things that City Manager Batista has tried to do is really grown that team with like the resources it needs to do a better job, because I think there's long been a reflection of like, oh gosh, we haven't been able to reach certain folks or could be doing a better job, but you need to have like the staffing capacity and the resources to do it. So that's been one of the intentional efforts in his office, was to centralize that, provide that support to, so that we don't have a community organizer, community communications person in each department, that it's kind of like getting centralized, and then all the departments get to benefit from that. So I think you'll hopefully see more and more improvement, but it's always something that we're not always like, doing the best job that we could at doing that. So if you ever have ideas too about places we should be or places that we're missing, we're always open to hearing that feedback too.
One last question to squeeze in. Thinking of projects like Union Station, where a lot of effort and resources went into it, but the use of it depends on other policies that may or may not be within your control. So how do you maximize sort of the return on all the effort and the resources that went in making it a good thing that it is today?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we've been working really hard at that. So Union Station, first and foremost, is an intermodal transit facility. That is its primary function and purpose. We used a lot of state and federal funds, particularly federal, to restore it, and we are able to access federal funds every year for its kind of upkeep and some of the preventive maintenance and whatnot and capital investments through the Federal Transit Administration. So that is important to keep in mind of that first and foremost. But there is usable space in the facility that is not just has to be common area for commuters. And so shortly we will have all of the usable space leased, which is a huge success because the amount that we can draw in from the leases offsets our operating costs as well. So I don't know that we'll have like a full cash flow year to year on Union Station, but at least we can make that operating obligation to the city of Worcester as low as possible. So a couple examples. On the second floor, the office space on the second floor is occupied by the Cannabis Control Commission of the Massachusetts. So we won that lease proposal. They pay a healthy amount of rent on that space. On the first floor, we have Luciano's restaurant on one side of the Grand Hall, and they're the ones that do the special events in the Grand Hall. And then on the other side of the Grand Hall, just opened last year, 961 Restaurant and Lounge, Lebanese food and lounge, that spent a significant amount of money getting that space up to code and all of that. Right now, actively under construction, and this speaks to some of the food stuff that we were talking about as well. Actively under construction in the lower section of Union Station is about 6,000 square feet for the new headquarters of the Worcester Regional Food Hub. And the Worcester Regional Food Hub does two things. They aggregate and distribute produce from farms in our region. So you might have like, just a quick kind of example of like, this farm has apples, but they can't fulfill the purchase order of UMass or the Worcester Public Schools, but if I take the apples from this farm and the 6 other farms in the surrounding towns, now we can collectively fulfill that order from UMass or the Worcester Public Schools. So the Food Hub facilitates that. They do the aggregation for those farms and then the distribution to those institutional buyers. So that's one aspect of what they do. And then they'll have 6 commercial kitchens there. That is really important for food entrepreneurship because it's very expensive to have a fully permitted commercial kitchen. But you have to have it for health regulations. Like you can't make granola in your house and sell it to the general public. That's not allowed. So having these fully permitted commercial kitchens, that's basically a membership model that you can rent. You can make that granola in their kitchen and then comply with those regulations. Or, you know, various value-added products, or even like they're talking about ghost kitchen setups too. So like actually hot prepared meals, DoorDash comes, and then like, so it's a way to like have some food entrepreneurs proof of concept before they take that big step to the question earlier about like BTs and some of these businesses. Before I sign myself up for a 5-year lease and all the investment that goes into building that restaurant, I can at least test my proof of concept. Maybe I could use this facility as a ghost kitchen, see if that'll resonate with folks on takeout, and then I'll take that next step on a brick and mortar. So that's going to be really huge for like the whole food entrepreneurship ecosystem. And then we have one other space, a small cafe space for commuters. It's only about like 300 square feet that we just put out to bid recently. So once those are kind of done, we'll have all of the other non-commuter usable space in Union Station leased up, and that's helpful for the city. And also, hopefully, we'll get that foot traffic going in the station that's not just people getting on the train, but people coming in to use the food hub, or people going to the restaurant, or people coming in for a wedding in the Grand Hall. So we've been trying to think about how do we make it like a real crown jewel for the city of Worcester. Yeah.
Speaking of crown jewels, Peter Dunn.
Hey.